Commandment 8. Thou shalt not steal. Do not harm your neighbor's externals, his property, as well as your own property. After the Lord God, with the sixth commandment, protected the physical life of our neighbor from harm on our part, instilling in us, at the same time, to protect our own lives, and then, with the seventh, indicated to us to lead a life both in soul and body in chastity and in general in the rules of pure morality. After all this, he protects our neighbors from our offenses and in that which only externally or materially belongs to them, and, at the same time, commands us that we ourselves treat our property wisely, with benefit. To this, he pronounced the eighth commandment: do not steal. Everything that only concerns the property of others and your own, from monetary capital to a needle and thread. All this is included in the circle of our duties according to the eighth commandment of God. Everything should be set out in the general rules under the title of this commandment. Against robbery, or the obvious and violent appropriation of other people's things. Robbery, as well as not helping one's neighbor against it. Do not commit violence. Do not be a robber. Prov. 22:22. Everything, every property has its owner. Property owned by no one is perhaps empty spaces of land. Here, only direct acquisition can belong to the one who first takes possession of a piece of land or begins to cultivate the land over a certain area. This right of possession, moreover, belongs more to states and peoples than to private individuals. The essential feature of robbery is violence in the face of the owner himself, or the owner of the things robbed, although without danger to his life. But when this violence is expressed in threats and is armed, then robbery passes into brigandage. Seeing a weapon in the hands of the attacker, the owner is all the more likely to give up the property that is the object of theft. But let there sometimes be violent actions and threats without presenting a danger either to the health or to the freedom of the owner. Let there even be no weapons or threats at all. However, the owner necessarily yields his property, because he sees the inequality of forces against the violence that can be used against him, because they certainly want to take from him something to which the taker has no right, and to take it with the purpose of stealing it. This brazen violation by robbers of the rights of another's property is the most criminal offense in robbery. Robbery is all the more guilty then when it is committed in the street, that is, before a large number of people whose presence one should be ashamed of. They run up to another, tear off his clothes or snatch something from his hands, and run away. Robbery is also more guilty when it occurs on the road, during someone's journey. At such a time, the need for things is more noticeable for everyone, and, consequently, everyone's property is even more dear to him. But even more guilty is robbery on special communication routes, such as a major highway, a pier by a river, railway cars. Because in such a case an insult is committed to the government, since the government especially patronizes communication routes, then security is violated, which should especially be on the routes of communication. In a word, the very name of robber is frightening. A robber is a common enemy of the well-being of others. He reveals the audacity of an evil will that does not respect the truth at all. And even if sometimes the things he steals are not in the eyes of the owner, he still steals openly, in the presence of other people. Likewise, not to give help against robbery, for example, from the cry of robbery, and to hide to the side or go inside your house is a great fault, because this means allowing another to commit robbery. Yes, in such a case you cannot consider yourself safe with your property and house. Today my neighbor was robbed, and tomorrow they can rob me too, if I, out of fear of interrogation in court, or in general out of indifference to the property of my neighbor, do not try to stop the robber as much as I can. Robber, is this a possible word in the society of orthodox Christians? And if you still bear the name of a Christian, remember the voice of Christ as the voice of a stern accuser. You are going out as if you were going out against a robber with swords and clubs. Matthew 26:55. You are taking away your neighbor's personal freedom for a time and his property forever, or almost forever. And oh, if only you would come sooner to the feelings of that other robber who begged Christ for the kingdom of heaven. Arson, or simply careless handling of fire, especially when smoking tobacco and inaction during a fire. Intentional arson is such a terrible crime, examples of which we do not see either in sacred history or in the life of ancient peoples. Think what the arsonist decides to do and what destruction he causes. For example, he sets fire to an uninhabited house in vexation that this house should pass from him to another heir or buyer, and in 1 hour the house does not disappear, which was built for a long time and which could have been used by others for a long time. And besides, although the house was not inhabited, it was located near other residential houses, which were in obvious danger of burning down. In his anger, he sets fire to another man's corn or mown hay in the field, or to a city dweller's orchard, a store with provisions, especially dangerous from this fire if the provisions were fatty, a woodpile, a storehouse with cloth goods, which, although they will not give off a flame, will only smolder. And behold, no trace remains of that with which God has endowed both men and beasts for food, with which, with moderation and thanks to God, men would have eaten and supported themselves for a long, long time. Out of revenge, he puts a fire under the house of a neighbor, and then, for the sake of special profit, he sets fire to his own insured house, and the fire, contrary to his expectations, embraces other buildings. In such a case, he robs his neighbors of the most necessary things in life, that is, shelter, which is not denied even to animals. At once, he deprives many of all the property that was accumulated over many years and labors. At once makes many beggars, and by setting fire to and destroying something of his own, but insured, he harms the insurance company. He destroys by fire the village or settlement from which he was exiled. And so, the poor inhabitants with bitter tears, with murmurings at their fate, or with curses on the villain they suspect, thus bring wood by wood and stone by stone, so as not to remain in the open air even during the winter itself. A gang of ill-intentioned people first plant notes about a fire, which means that this is the most difficult crime for the conscience when they involuntarily warn about it. Meanwhile, how, without warning, they could have committed it more easily. Having warned the inhabitants by notes or by word of mouth alone, the gang sets fire to the whole city from different ends, rushes with fire into the courtyards and houses. It decides on all this villainy and with such daring courage only for the sake of, for example, taking revenge on the government, political revenge, or forcing the inhabitants to take out large insurance policies on their houses. Some rich people had such plans. And so, some of the houses burn, and in the process, perhaps, centuries-old monuments and such precious things turn to dust that nothing can restore or replace them. In other houses, only destruction and loss of many things occurs. In others, the owners incur vain expenses in order to transport their property further out of town and preserve it during several anxious days. In others, they give their last ruble so that their buildings would be insured against fire in society for the future, for the sake of one fear of losing everything. Meanwhile, and money at this time sometimes has no value, because houses are not such things that can always be found ready, as other things are bought in a store. They require materials, hands, and time. When all this is ready, only then will the burned out see their losses replenished. Especially how terrible is the guilt of deliberate arson at night, when a person cannot think of what to save from his property, when even the firemen with their fire-extinguishing shells are late, or act in the dark without success. How terrible is the arson of a powder magazine, and also of mines, which require especially large expenses for their construction. Here, we are not talking about the impressions of arson on the health of the inhabitants, about the alarming alarm bell, shaking both old and young, or about the fear of black hanging balls, about injuries in a fire, about colds at night, which sometimes end in death, about the burning of people, about the proximity of a hospital to the center of the fire, where the unfortunate cannot save even themselves. Are not these crimes more terrible than each other? And is not the deliberate arsonist the most evil of all evildoers? What is the fault of the houses and property which he destroys? Is it not peculiar to evil spirits only to destroy everything so aimlessly out of malice? Yes, here we recall the malice of the devil, by whose action the crops of righteous Job were burned. We recall the malice of the demons who rushed into the water with a herd of pigs. The guilt of the arsonist is not destroyed if his arson is prevented by the efforts of others or extinguished at the very beginning, independently of his will. Only in such a case is his guilt, and consequently his punishment, lessened if he, having placed combustible substances near the building, himself notifies of the fire that has started, or, in addition, renders assistance against the fire at the risk of his life. Then we see him guilty only of the attempt to start the fire. We see him repentant, since otherwise his assistance against the fire could not have been before self-sacrifice and disregard for personal danger. Is it not typical after this for the malicious arsonists of an entire city to expect that the first lightning during a thunderstorm will fall on their heads? Can they not consider themselves deserving of eternal fire in the next world for their evil fire? My God, how terrible is their crime, or of the fear of black hanging balls, of injuries in a fire, of colds at night, which sometimes end in death, of people being burned to death, of the proximity of a hospital to the center of a fire, where the unfortunate cannot save even themselves. Are not these crimes one more terrible than the other? And is not the deliberate arsonist the most villainous of villains after this? What is the fault of the houses and property which he destroys? Is it not peculiar to evil spirits alone to destroy everything so aimlessly out of malice? Yes, here we recall the malice of the devil, by whose action the crops of righteous Job were burned. We recall the malice of the demons, who rushed into the water with a herd of pigs. The guilt of the arsonist is not destroyed if his arson is prevented by the efforts of others or extinguished at the very beginning, independently of his will. Only in such a case is his guilt, and consequently his punishment, lessened if he, having placed combustible substances near the building, himself notifies of the fire that has started, or, in addition, renders assistance against the fire at the risk of his life. Then we see him guilty only of the attempt to start the fire. We see him repentant, since otherwise his assistance against the fire could not have been before self-sacrifice and disregard for personal danger. Is it not typical after this for the malicious arsonists of an entire city to expect that the first lightning during a thunderstorm will fall on their heads? Can they not consider themselves deserving of eternal fire in the next world for their evil fire? My God, how terrible is their crime, or of the fear of black hanging balls, of injuries in a fire, of colds at night which sometimes end in death, of people being burned to death, of the proximity of a hospital to the center of a fire, where the unfortunate cannot save even themselves. Are not these crimes one more terrible than the other? And is not the deliberate arsonist the most villainous of villains after this? What is the fault of the houses and property which he destroys? Is it not peculiar to evil spirits alone to destroy everything so aimlessly out of malice? Yes, here we recall the malice of the devil, by whose action the crops of righteous Job were burned. We recall the malice of the demons, who rushed into the water with a herd of pigs. The guilt of the arsonist is not destroyed if his arson is prevented by the efforts of others or extinguished at the very beginning, independently of his will. Only in such a case is his guilt, and consequently his punishment lessened, if he, having placed combustible substances near the building, himself notifies of the fire that has started or, in addition, renders assistance against the fire at the risk of his life. Then we see him guilty only of the attempt to start the fire. We see him repentant, since otherwise his assistance against the fire could not have been before self-sacrifice and disregard for personal danger. Is it not typical after this for the malicious arsonists of an entire city to expect that the first lightning during a thunderstorm will fall on their heads? Can they not consider themselves deserving of eternal fire in the next world for their evil fire? My God, how terrible is their crime! Then, and only careless handling of fire and combustible objects constitutes a great guilt, because this carelessness often leads to the same consequences as a deliberate or prepared fire. This carelessness is one of the most criminal human carelessnesses. Not to mention cases of, so to speak, forgotten fire, for example, when illegal crowding is allowed in buildings. When stoves are dangerously constructed, chimneys are not cleaned, combustible objects and fire-lighting materials are carelessly stored somewhere. How many cases are there in which a person, carrying fire in his hands, leaves behind a trace of a whole flame? For example, a fire will be left unextinguished in a field near a forest, straw standing on the roots, or harvested grain. They will burn bushes, roots, branches at an unauthorized time, that is, when there is a strong wind or hot and dry weather. And lo, a forest fire begins. How much timber is wasted here? How many poor people will freeze in their homes in winter, having to think about every log because of the high price of firewood? How much new waste is spent in order to put out a forest fire, waste of both labor and time? Because forest fires sometimes last for weeks, the fire from them penetrates into the earth, where there is peat. In general, they require an enormous reserve of counteracting force. The barn will be left without any supervision during the heating, and in a short time the bread, this gift of God, which would feed many families, will perish. Someone walked around his yard with a lit torch or with a candle in the storeroom before nightfall, or in general in rooms outside of living rooms. In the latter places a spark of fire could still be noticed. Someone carelessly put a lamp, did not extinguish or did not take away candles from somewhere, left hot coals or a samovar with hot coals in the wind to cool. And behold, in all such cases, the owner of the house himself suddenly loses all his property and makes his neighbors homeless. When a thief steals at night with a candle and unintentionally causes a fire, then two offenses are distinguished: theft and careless arson. And how many houses, buildings, and various materials burn from smoking tobacco? Is it not smoking tobacco that increases fires lately? Is it not from it that courtyard buildings catch fire, that houses themselves and entire residential areas burn down? They smoke in haylofts and attics. They smoke in the streets and squares, where it is forbidden, for example, where there are chips from the building. They smoke in pine forests. They throw half-smoked tobacco before going to bed on the table where the papers are, and so, for the sake of a whimsical pleasure that one person was enjoying at the time, many valuables are destroyed. Innocent or poor people are deprived of the most necessary things in life, like a warm corner. In order to smoke tobacco, a person needs to go everywhere with fire, which he did not need before, and others who do not smoke do not need. What can we say about such a way of handling fire, which shows obvious and daring carelessness, but which fortunately remains harmless? For example, they do not want to inspect the yard and the storeroom, where they went in the wind and before night with a candle. They cook resin without any precaution. They do not look after the iron stove in the carpenter's shop, where there is a pile of shavings and dry wood. The guilt of these people can be compared with the guilt of the man who shoots at a target where there are many passers-by, but fortunately does not kill anyone. Oh, how much carelessness, frivolity, and insolence in the handling of fire by these people. Finally, inaction at a fire is a fault against the property of one's neighbor, because an increasing fire increases the losses. This inaction consists of indifferently watching the fire instead of extinguishing it, which, however, is possible and to which all spectators are invited. Failure to notify of a fire that has occurred and failure to call others to help. Failure to hurry without good reason to a fire in the forests. Unauthorized abandonment of only a dying fire, but not one that is completely extinguished. Recall when a house, factory, steamship, or warehouse is burning. A recall of such a kind that the owner of one or another is able to bear the fire losses or is not worth regretting at all. And hence, instead of pity, laughter, and guffaws at a fire, instead of exciting others to extinguish the fire, cooling someone else's jealousy to extinguish it. Then, carelessness to acquire firefighting equipment and have a sufficient number of firefighters, fire station. Oh, how much economic wealth would be preserved and would be enough to be owned for decades. How many completely useless expenses and needs would be prevented if we did not have fires, if people would guard against fire as it is fire at every step. Can the Church not cry out against this worldly evil if it leaves behind such destructive traces for the well-being of the people? If from arson or just from careless handling of fire, even the temples of God, the most sacred places, burn. That is why, reader, we have set out this question before you in detail. And regarding the public economy and against the anxiety of residents, we are sincerely concerned, because all this has a great influence on the religious and ecclesiastical life of the people. Oh, if only those enemies Luke, 1927, the arsonists, would cease to exist in the world. If only those who are careless with fire, unintentional enemies but still enemies of the general well-being and peace, would begin to handle this dangerous element with all caution and would not, by the way, give rise to sad news in the summer issues of newspapers about fires and fires. Robbing the homes of widows and orphans. Woe was pronounced by Christ the Savior upon the scribes and Pharisees for devouring, that is, robbing under the pretext of piety, the houses of widows, Matt 23:14. And in the Old Testament, the man who only took a widow's last garment as a pledge was severely condemned. You shall not take a widow's garment as a pledge, Doi. 24:17 there, a needy widow for her own needs was placed next to the Levite's ex. 22:24. Therefore, to defraud widows and orphans of their property is a great sin, and whether someone directly appropriates their capital or robs them under the pretext of goodwill, and, taking advantage of their trust, or only ruins their property, the end is the same. The impoverishment of the widow, or the greater impoverishment of the orphans. This is even a sin crying to heaven, do it. 14:28, because a widow is a defenseless creature. She has only one defense, only one weapon tears. This sin and several degrees more are increased if the guardian or executor robs the orphans, because here, in addition to malicious robbery, the trust that the law and good people have placed in the honesty of the guardian is abused. Christian, let the widow's and orphan's property be especially inviolable for you. Just as throwing a single chip into the yard of a poor widow is already good, so to take away no more than a chip from there is evil. Oppression of a roadman by payment. You shall not oppress a stranger or ill-treat him, Acts 22:21. It is known about the ancient publicans that they oppressed the people with excessive levies on bridges and at other points of communication. And now, such ordeals are no better. Cabbies, coachmen, in bad weather or in case of a shortage of spare carts, assign a road person a double or triple fee for travel, and, having assigned it so, do not even want to continue the conversation. The owners of road carts for a certain fee, and in a certain space and place pretentiously guard them, and demand that no one, even the most poor person, bypass them. Every one would take only their carts. no matter how much it costs them. Otherwise, they will stop a carriage with strange horses and detain the traveler. Ferrymen across a river, obliged to ferry people free of charge in their own way, conditionally with local or zemstvo institution, do not rise at night for their business otherwise than after hearing a promise of a special reward for themselves, or having received this reward in advance. And also during the day in the spring, when the river has not yet been properly crossed, while the traveler needs to hurry, and during the day they charge 3 times the established rate for an hour of their work, holding up entire convoys with their extortion. Captains on steamships or the owners of steamships themselves insistently and rudely demand additional payment from the person who, due to the weakness of his strength, would like to take shelter in the cabin during a stormy or cold night. Meanwhile, they are not able to make them a new payment, and meanwhile, the room in the cabins, class, remains free. Coastal residents seem to be glad of the opportunity when it is necessary to remove someone's ship or steamboat that has been driven ashore or aground near them. They announce a fee for their work instead of tens of rubles hundreds, and instead of several hundred thousands. Those who watch shipping at the piers illegally detain a vessel or raft under the pretext of registration and inspection, or directly make an illegal collection from the boatmen. Conductors, or even the heads of the railways themselves, attach themselves to the insignificant hand luggage of a passenger, if they see the slightest reason for this, demanding a special fee for this luggage or subjecting it to a fine. They sometimes deprive the comfort of the lower class and fall asleep, forcing them to take the upper or special sleeping class. Suppliers of food on steamships and on the railway charge double and triple the price for everything. The innkeepers, both for food and accommodation for the traveler himself and for fodder for his road cattle, as well as blacksmiths for the repair of road carriages, are not satisfied with adding half a third or a third to the usual fee, but a point more, in a word, as soon as the keepers of rooms and hotels for travelers want to take for 1 hour of accommodation in addition to a day, they take as for a whole day. The accommodation itself, the service, the maintenance are valued so highly that to eat at their table, to breathe the air in their room for 1 day, is equal somewhere to a month's maintenance. Candles, water to wash, and for tea, wine, for all excessive prices. Is this not really an ordeal? Is all this not forced extortion? Hard for a traveler also because it is combined with a haughty look at him, with dry and rude answers, with a readiness to detain him on the way for a contradiction to pay the missing ruble or even kopecks. It would be necessary for guides to remember that the situation of every person on the road is a situation that is partly critical. Such a situation, on the contrary, should be treated with sympathy and indulgence. At the same time, every traveler, indeed, is in some dependence on them. But that for some travelers it costs nothing to pay their high prices for carts, for rooms, or maintenance. That others only seek, perhaps out of vanity, high prices, for example, to stay in the most expensive hotel. This is not an excuse for them when they charge dearly or extra. Why take the same prices from less wealthy people? One person may perhaps be called wealthy, but on the road he spends all his money reserves. Another does not argue about the fee only for the sake of his dignity, but is burdened by the high fee and has no opportunity to find another way of communication or another road apartment. No, the examples we have given are a real ordeal, and they are not excusable in relation to even wealthy people among those traveling, and they are criminal in relation to the poor and destitute. One, for example, the head of the expedition of exiles, robbed those being escorted into exile, and finally, he himself was sent away as a criminal with the exiles. What can be done? What can one wish against these oppressions of the road? Where do they occur? On the one hand, it is unpleasant and not excusable, the ignorance of commoners, cab drivers, courtyard keepers, etc., who oppress road people with pay. It is necessary, therefore, to wish them education, sociability in their behavior, and moderation in demands for their goods. On the other hand, it is far, far from enough to have only external education, even strict orders from the government, from the owners of the railways, and even complaints in the newspaper about the monetary oppression of travelers. All these measures are not enough for travel guides, from the barman on the steamer to the station master on the railway, to spare the condition of the traveler who comes into their power for a certain time. It is necessary, above all, for these, as well as for those first, to have Christian kindness of heart, to put themselves in the position of the traveler or passer-by, and to sympathize with the travelers. Oh, if you, our reader, are yourself a travel guide, or only often meet them through acquaintance in the first case, remember to yourself, and in the second explain to others that the oppression of a neighbor on the road by payment is the most dishonest quality and a sin before God. But how pleasant, how kind is the kind and indulgent guide in fees and receptions. A traveler remembers such a guide with pleasure for a long time and would be ready 100 times to receive him in his home with grateful embraces. A Samaritan who raised a beaten man from the road and selflessly cared for the beaten man is recognized as a benefactor. But the innkeeper at whose place he stopped with the beaten man turned out to be very kind, because he received 2 pieces of silver and did not demand more. 199, Luke 10:35. Damage to communication routes and means. Desolation and destruction are in their paths. Isaiah 59:7. This is also partly a kind of robbery, when someone through extreme negligence does not repair the roads, much less with obvious malice and self-interest spoils them, as well as other means of communication. For example, they hinder passage on sidewalks and bridges, travel through the streets and in the field, leaving something heavy and bulky on the road indicated for everyone. They destroy a dam or do not lower the water at the right time. Do not raise floating bridges. Transfer cables from one bank to the other. Do not divert ferry transport and thus, inevitably, stop the passage of ships, steamboats, rafts with trees. Damage the telegraph in order to steal some things from its composition, or cause confusion in the telegraph a delay in order to have time to carry out some criminal plan against someone's property. In the postal service, they lose through carelessness, forgetfulness, or intentionally simple and insurance letters. Only hold-up letters and packages being delivered, delay the sending of incoming mail longer than the specified time, refuse to accept and issue letters and parcels without a valid reason, and, moreover, with rudeness, do not deliver information to the senders, or do not satisfy them in the event of losses in the mail, etc. In such cases, those expenses and efforts that have already been used and are being used by the Treasury or Society on the way of communication turn out to be in vain. And then time is taken away in traveling, in delivering or sending something, time that is often more valuable than money. As for the post in particular, each member of the public entrusts his property and even his face, his personal secrets to it. It, like other state-owned transport, exists by virtue of the public's trust. That is why stops, dissatisfaction, insults to people who come, send, or receive are so sensitive. A simple letter, for example, means nothing to strangers less than a scrap of paper that can only be thrown away or burned. But it, especially a family letter, is dear to those from whom and to whom it is sent. So, reader, in the ways and means of communication that others manage, it only remains to fulfill and fulfill. Here, on the part of the executors, there is nothing personal or gift-given, but everything is only state or public. And again, how pleasant and dear are those executors who, without any delay and to the point of self-sacrifice, meet and see off someone or something in travel communication. During a crop failure, or in times of emergency, excessively expensive sale of vital supplies. He that withholdeth grain, the people curse him. Prov. 11:26. Vital supplies, such as bread, grain, and vegetable products, fodder for cattle, fuel for stoves, are not luxury items or whims that can be left, and it would be good to leave. But these are purchases that cannot be dispensed with, and which both the rich and the poor need. Therefore, trade in them, as pure and honest and, so to speak, patriarchal, can just as easily be in the hands of other people, or at other times resemble robbery. Another has prepared for himself in an economic way, or only bought grain, hay, lighting materials at a low price, but offers for sale many times more expensive, and even delays selling, even if there is a crop failure or a temporary shortage of these supplies due to impassable roads. He delays in order to wait for even higher prices. In such a case, he takes what is superfluous for himself without right, and takes away from the poor even the last penny, taking advantage of the difficult situation of all. He seems to be glad of the crop failure and the need that has arisen for food, as if he were glad of the people's misfortune, while all the others sigh. It is not with gratitude to God for his household supplies that he offers them to others for sale, but only seeks an opportunity to sell them more expensively. No. Trade in vital supplies, as the primary needs of man's existence, always requires moderation, and then there is nothing more honest than it. But if, during a crop failure or an accidental need, some traders extract for themselves from this trade the means of becoming comparatively rich, then poverty is truly ready to curse them. And it must be noted that this curse is not like that which is pronounced in anger alone. In moments of irritation, caused by hunger and suffering, it can have its own destructive power, sir. 4. 6. Why does the merchant act in this way? Who would not suffer any loss if he sold his provisions at half the price? But an exorbitant reduction in the price of vital provisions is also an act of violence against the property of one's neighbor, if it is done deliberately. They lower the price of provisions that are brought in or delivered from outside. And what happens? They stop bringing these items in because there is an obvious loss from bringing them in. Then, instead of a surplus, there is a real shortage of the most essential items, and the merchants who have a stock of them again raise their prices exorbitantly. Christian, if it depends on you, and to whatever extent it will depend, use all measures and concessions from yourself so that the most necessary provisions in human life are made cheaper. Then you will be a friend of the people, a benefactor of your neighbors. Generally, disproportionate prices for goods, for your service or for some personal service, is it possible to determine proportionate prices for goods each time, and for a private position or for some short-term service a reward? It is possible. This proportionality is known to everyone who is engaged in such matters. The goods are prepared at home or bought wholesale from others. Thus, the addition of a price on them over and above the cost can easily be determined. It is also possible to appoint and ask for payment for some private service, for example, for the construction of a railway, for a zemstvo, or for a special service to someone, for example, to carry out an assignment partly by comparing these activities with the work of other people, partly by spending a certain amount of time on these activities. But if others do not hold some goods and trade them, for example, cellar wines, in some place of the unit, and these goods are sold at a disproportionate price, is this not a violent appropriation of someone else's money? The buyer could have chosen not to buy an expensive product, but he takes it willingly or unwillingly because he does not know where to get it, while it is a necessary purchase for him given the circumstances. He leaves the store with a sigh and perhaps with an empty purse, and the seller is merry and triumphant. The seller does not care about the poverty of the buyer. Or, for example, someone appoints and receives many thousands a year for his service, taking advantage of the fact that he is invited to serve in a huge capital business, and that there are few people like him who are suited for this business. But is not such an excessive assessment of oneself, one's abilities and knowledge, a sin? Does not a person here use the opportunity only to make a profit, to make a capital for himself? And does not his enormous remuneration, for example, from the Zemstvo service, also often go to the people, among whom, meanwhile, there are many poor? Likewise, do those people act honestly who, having not previously demanded payment for some personal service, then demand a payment that is both great in itself and beyond the means of the neighbor who has accepted the service from them, for example, for homework? After all, it is possible to raise the price for goods or the reward for labor in favorable circumstances, and indefinitely. Oh, dear people, for their goods, or for personal services and services, dear not so much because of the essence of the matter as because of their greed and conceit. It is not enough for you, no matter how much you receive. But look how others are no less capable of business than you, and even work harder than you, but are content with much less for their good and occupation. See that after the dear and inaccessible you are not left completely unoccupied with anything. God often acts this way with such people. Embezzlement in contracts, in the entrusted storage or expenditure of state money or things, the treasury is the common property of the state. Although the one who robs it may not see the owner face to face, in a distant sense, every honest member of the state can be called its owner, who necessarily participates in the formation of state capital and property with his taxes, duties, and special donations. Consequently, the robber of the treasury takes away the property not from one person, but from many people. The gravity of his robbery is not noticeable to others, but it is true. From this follows the criminality of embezzlement. Thus, for example, officials steal the treasury during contracts. Here, there is a double sin, and there is a loss to the state money, because the contractor counts out a special sum to the official conducting the bidding, while he could leave an extra sum in the treasury and delivers things, or carries out constructions not in full kindness. Because the one who took money from him for the contract is afraid or ashamed to be demanding of him. And sometimes officials of those places where public auctions are held take on contracts themselves in the name of their wives or through another figurehead. Thus, people who have public money or things in their hands use all of this for their own needs until a shortfall in them is discovered, or lend others money because of the profit, as well as things, for example, those that are coming from contractors for delivery. Thus, a person authorized to receive and spend public money and things either records them as income in a smaller amount than is actually received, or marks them as expenditure, and then another who is supposed to receive them for his work or service, or as a reward, orders to mark with his own receipt much more than he actually gives out. The state grain and salt, military equipment, and clothing are shown either damaged, so that they can then be sold at public auction and transferred to one's own name at the auction, or they are considered completely lost, supposedly due to unforeseen circumstances, so that they can be turned into property without further questions. And is it possible to calculate all the predatory attacks of this kind on the treasury, which for some reason no one spares, and which is considered inexhaustible? True, the civil law strictly judges for exposed embezzlement, but it is difficult to expose and is easily tolerated where there is no Christian conscience and firm fear of God. For example, for a supplier, it is sometimes easier to give money than things and materials that are to be delivered to the treasury under contract, and the receiver takes money from him undoubtedly in a smaller quantity, in exchange for things that are thus considered accepted into the treasury, but will never end up in the treasury. Thus, against embezzlement, the only surest warning is a Christian conscience and contentment with the remuneration due for service or position. The guilt of this sin can be less only when, having squandered or forcibly appropriated state money and things, he himself returns them in full, moreover, before his abuses are discovered. Readers, the treasury respects our personal property. For example, it recognizes the hereditary possessions of families. So, the members of the state must respect its property. oppression of the debtor and his very deprivation with a previously thought-out plan to transfer all the remaining property of his into his own ownership. He, the debtor, was strangled, saying, "Pay me what you owe." And he went and put him in prison. Matthew 18:28. 30 debts in the needs of family life, and especially in commercial matters, are inevitable. There are not enough or none at all of one's own funds, and the expense and the need sometimes cannot be postponed, such as, for example, a daughter's marriage, a funeral, a trip, some kind of destruction in the house, the deadline for payment for goods on a loan, and finally, and only an exceptional time to stock up on some purchases. Then one cannot help but resort to a loan. One cannot help but become a debtor. A loan is a legal turnover of business, just as on the part of the creditor this legal temporary concession to another of his money or expendable things. The debtor becomes their owner and is responsible for all cases of their loss. A rich lender should be lenient to such debtors in particular. In order to show leniency, he can choose two paths. A. Forgive the debt completely. B. Defer its payment. If the forgiveness of a debt is not forced by circumstances, but is entirely voluntary so that the creditor could, by law, subject his debtor to imprisonment, then this is an evangelical virtue. Then the creditor who believes and acts in this way according to his faith is himself honored with a special mercy from God. His sins are forgiven, which constitute his own debt to the Lord God, and for which he brings repentance. Matt 18:35. And the deferment of a debt in its own way is also a merciful measure in relation to the debtor, but it should already be partly in justice. A rich creditor will not suffer any special loss from it, and the poor payer, meanwhile, will have time to improve his affairs. But here is another of the creditors who does not want to do either one or the other. He does not forgive the debt and does not defer it. But, reasoning spiritually, he could completely forgive the poor man's debt, because he himself remains a debtor to God of 10,000 talents, about 18 million rubles, while the debtor owes him only 100 denarii, about 20 rubles. But what is the fault of the creditor with respect to another's property if he oppresses for a debt? In that the debtor oppressed by him is forced to sell his things for a small price in order to pay him the debt, and even, perhaps, to lose his house altogether. The creditor sends to the debtor every now and then for the debt, and meanwhile knows for sure that the debtor would be glad to pay if he had any money. The creditor's fault is that he threatens the poor debtor with personal detention, arrest, and finally actually puts him in prison. Imprisonment for debt, not to mention the mental anguish and dishonor, takes away from the debtor time that he could use to improve his affairs, and further upsets his business affairs. We do not mean here malicious or careless insolvency and unresolved questions about how much, to whom, and for what reason the debtor has entered into large debts, questions by virtue of which it is sometimes necessary to actually detain him. When there is nothing to take from the debtor, and his debt is insignificant, and moreover the debt did not arise from dishonest causes, for example, the debtors themselves have betrayed him, then the creditor, imprisoning the debtor, imprisoning him there at his own expense, what does he want more than to satisfy his own revenge? In such a case, the debtor, having endured a term of imprisonment, which by law must be equal to the amount of his debt, already ceases to be a debtor 200. It is even worse if the lender thinks it over beforehand and becomes convinced that the debtor will not be able to pay him the debt, and that in the extreme case he will be forced to part with his last property, for example, a house or a factory. Finding the rest of his property advantageous for himself, the rich lender readily lends him the required amount. But at the same time he delivers it in such a way from the first time, and then in the subsequent time he conducts the business in such a way that he can easily transfer the rest of the debtor's property into his own ownership. Is this not subtle robbery? Can one expect here mercy to him who has shown no mercy, James 2:13. You, Christian, be merciful to the debtor who sincerely says to you, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." Matthew 18:26. Who sincerely desires to pay. This time, coercive measures will not increase his ability to pay. They will not squeeze money out of him if he doesn't have any. The habit of getting into debt and paying it off slowly, or not paying it at all. One should only decide to go into debt in the most pressing circumstances. Meanwhile, some ask to borrow money or borrow things or materials without any need, simply because they are being lent. They borrowed today, but they ask to borrow tomorrow. Today they borrowed from one, and tomorrow they borrow from another, although, let us assume, without the intention of yet renouncing the debt. In a word, they borrow as long as they are being lent. Is this not an encumbrance for others, and not violence against someone else's property? The creditor may be ashamed to refuse, while he himself is in need of available capital. And more often than not, he would be ready to refuse. But having lent earlier, he fears that the debtor, upset by him, might deny the previous debt. Then one should go into debt to the extent that there is hope of paying them off, and with an indication of a definite, or only approximate, term for their payment. When the debtor brings his debt in due time, and especially before the appointed time, then the creditor is calm and satisfied. Then the creditor is ready to entrust him with a loan again. In such a case, some wealthy people are actually pleased with the honesty or diligence of the debtor. In the name of honesty, they are ready to lend again. But a delayed debt, perhaps, forces the lender himself to borrow from others, to go and beg for his own money. Deprives him of the opportunity to be punctual in payments to others. Causes him losses, because in a certain case he counted on money from his debtor, as on his own money and cash, and meanwhile was deceived. And also leads him to doubt and anxiety. And again, is this not violence against the property of a neighbor? They remind the debtor of the debt, and he answers, "I will pay in a week." They remind him again, and he appoints a new date, and so on for several more dates, justifying perhaps the very last of them. This slowness in payment occurs either because they borrowed beyond their means, or because they simply do not care about paying. Finally, one must, without a doubt, enter into debt with a spiritual disposition to pay it. A loan consists in the borrower returning to his lender either a sum of money in its entirety, if there was no agreement on special interest, or things or materials according to their number, in full measure or weight, in a word, everything in a quantity and quality equal to the loan. Meanwhile, another borrows, and upon leaving the creditor already forgets about the debt, decides on a loan, and does not think of ever paying it back, even having a fortune. Uses from his lender not at all objects of whim, which it was also within his discretion to buy or not to buy, like fashionable things from a store, etc. But the primary need, or the most necessary thing in life, like lodging in someone's house, it would be impossible to live on the street, and does not value it, does not have time to pay the debt, and has no sure hope for payment, and meanwhile continues to live, not at all limiting himself in unnecessary expenses, does not increase his work in order to have the opportunity to pay at least in parts. He hears 100 times a reminder of the debt, many times receives a written bill, reads letters from the post office with the same reminders, even forces the creditor himself to be with him, to come to him, perhaps from a distant place. And so now he keeps silent. Now he replies with a lack of money. Now he hides from the creditor. Now he does not acknowledge the debt at all. Now, revealing himself in debt by some written document or by obvious witnesses, he becomes angry with his creditor. Until then, everything was peace. Everyone called the lender a good, excellent person. But as soon as he began to ask for a debt, even modestly, then there is no peace with him. So he is both an enemy and an unkind person. As if it were a vice, in fact, to remind about the debt and not to keep someone else's. Is this not the seizure of someone else's property? Yes. The debtor robs, first of all, his creditor, because from his penalty, together with others like him, the capital trade of others completely collapses. At least, the debtor introduces obvious losses to the creditor and makes him anxious. The creditor decides on new expenses, for example, presents a claim to the court for collection, and, however, receives nothing. Spends time to go to justices of the peace and to the courts, but even here he is not satisfied for a long time because of the evasiveness of the debtor. He often scolds him in his soul or publicly, and does not see any benefit from the scolding itself. The defaulter in significant debts robs others, with whom apparently he no longer has any relationship. How does he rob? By forcing them to pay his creditor in excess for the goods of the purchase, since another merchant creditor, through lack of generosity, wants to make up for the money he loses in debt by an excessive price for goods. Is all this not a semblance of robbery on the part of the debtor? And how does he think he will die, leaving behind him careless and malicious debts? Are not great debts a bondage for his soul? But on the contrary, a God-fearing Christian, even if he is in debt out of necessity, will never tolerate that people come to his house demanding a debt. He himself takes care of his debts. He even likes to pay his debts. He feels a special kind of pleasure and peace when he honestly pays off his creditors, because here there really is for him a certain reminder, a certain connection with the matter of his moral debts. We mean sins before God. These very debts bind the conscience even more strongly and disturb the soul. You, prudent Christian, with God's help, adhere this time to these rules. Live and conduct your everyday affairs only with cash. In the case of forced debts, ask the creditors for forgiveness and indulgence regarding payments, and at the very time of payment thank them for their favor and patience. Bankruptcy through one's own fault or completely false. He owed 10,000 talents. Matthew 18:24. This is the unpaid debtor, who in the merchant class is called bankrupt. That is a person so insolvent that neither his capital, nor his goods, nor his property would be enough to cover all the debts that are presented to him or that still remain unknown. Bankruptcy through one's own fault occurs from negligent, or, on the contrary, from bold, too enterprising conduct of business. A merchant entrusts the management of his trade to others, while he himself loves only to feast or spend time in public pleasures, does not care to prepare materials for the factory in a timely manner, or does not take advantage of the best time to sell his products and thus upsets his fortune. Or he takes on contracts beyond his means, adds new business to his existing trade or factory business without a reserve of funds, starts many buildings without finding out the benefit from them, sells his goods for next to nothing, just so as not to miss out on making a large purchase of new ones. And then, suddenly, he becomes bankrupt. Is this voluntary and disinterested poverty? No. If someone is bankrupt from negligence, then it means he did not know how to give away money to the traders. Matt 18:25, 27, 28, and if from excessive and bold enterprise, then he was greedy for making capital for himself. In both cases, calling himself a careless bankrupt, he punishes others. Thus, perhaps, another widow, wanting to have a profit from her current state, handed over her last 100 rubles to him. As a man by general opinion rich, and he suddenly presents himself as insolvent or is recognized as such by his main creditors, willingly or unwillingly. After this, does he not bring himself and others to poverty? Can he be trusted to continue trading? And so, justly according to the law, he is deprived of the rights of trade. 201 woe to him who enriches himself beyond measure with what is not his own. Hab 2:6. This is already a malicious bankrupt. To falsely present oneself as insolvent is malicious bankruptcy. True, Even such a debtor has no cash or available property to cover his debts. But before presenting himself as insolvent, he transfers his property or transfers property without money into other hands, hides the rest of the capital, transports his goods to other people's shops, and in his shops or storerooms leaves only a little and the worst for appearance's sake. And he does all this solely with the intent to offer in payment instead of a ruble half or even less under the pretext of unfortunate affairs. This bankrupt is obliged by law to sign a pledge not to conceal anything of his property, and yet he bases the whole affair on this concealment, and, after an easy settlement with the creditors, to take possession of their capital, which was entrusted to him in parts. The creditors, willingly or unwillingly, agree to half the payment from him, and sometimes to none at all. They see in his hands their property, hidden only for a time, and cannot expose him, because all evidence has been previously eliminated by him. But he rarely acts alone in this case. He has a friend protector who assumes the guise of his creditor. This friend and supposed rich creditor is sometimes the first to yield to him in accepting from him an insignificant payment of debts. Sometimes he himself pays for it to other creditors in any case. He immediately makes some kind of fortune for himself from other people's capital. Is all this not violence against the property of others? Is it not robbery? Public opinion persecutes the malicious bankrupt as well as his accomplices. That is why, having finished his business with profit, he is afraid to suddenly show himself in society. But his conscience persecutes him even more. He meets with an even greater punishment in the failure of his subsequent affairs. By the judgment of his conscience, for example, he deprives himself of the right to make any significant donation to the church, because a sacrifice from the stolen property is not pleasing to God. O insolvent debtor of large capitals, would it not be better for you to admit to your creditors your inability to pay them your debts and to hand over to their power and discretion both the remains of your available capital and all your property? But you do so many grievous offenses to so many people. You anger God so much with deceptions, vain oaths, and even with your voluntary, as it were, imprisonment at home and idle inaction until the case of your debts is decided. Failure to compensate a neighbor for his losses or labor, as much as was required to be compensated. In the Old Testament, there was a law to compensate a person for the losses that someone else did to him. For example, if his field, garden, or harvest were spoiled, to compensate either with a larger amount than what was spent, or with things of better quality. X. 22:5-6. The New Testament truth of a Christian, without a doubt, must outweigh this truth. What losses can there be on the part of our neighbor for us? They can consist either in money that he spent for our benefit, or in his property that we damaged or completely lost, for example, renting an apartment in his house. This also includes offerings gifts to us from an artist, writer, craftsman, craftswoman of their noble works. Let these be gifts, but of such a kind that they are brought by the poor or indigent and received by one who has wealth. Brings with diligence and respect, but at the same time, in addition to his personal labor, he himself must pay others some part of what he brings. He brings, let us say, without any call from others, or by his own mistake, in the false hope of help, of reward. But still he spends money, loses, making an offering. Meanwhile, for the recipient it would cost him nothing to pay him. Otherwise, there would be an opportunity to reject to return his offering itself. How many such unpaid offerings are there to the insult and grief of those who bring them? If in general our neighbor does not demand compensation from us for damages because of his conscientiousness or because he cannot clearly prove the losses incurred, which meanwhile are not subject to doubt, then we ourselves must offer him compensation, which is in his will to accept or not. And if he expects a compensation, in such a case a refusal on our part will be a violent taking away of his property. Likewise, how unfair it is to leave someone's personal labor without any reward, or to reward him for it too stingily. Here, we do not mean the fulfillment of payment under a contract. If payment reward for labor has been agreed upon or definitely promised, then it remains to be literally fulfilled, just as the labor itself has been exactly fulfilled. But perhaps the payment was offered only in such words: "I will pay, I will not leave without gratitude." For personal labor, a person who earns his living from his own hands should be rewarded proportionate to how similar labor is rewarded in other cases or by other people. Such, for example, are the private petty work of a craftsman for a day or a few hours, a copyist of some papers, etc. Personal strength, that is physical and mental, is the internal root property of a person, his personality. Let us suppose that a person does not suffer any loss here, does not give anything materially from himself, or subtract anything from his purse. But is not his service even more important when he serves us not with dead property or a money purse, but personally, with his own strength? Special attention, special proportionality should be shown this time to the services of a neighbor to the highest and most honorable, in which, that is, his mind and heart participated more than his physical strength, such as, for example, the service of an intelligent but poor advisor in business, a priest who performs church services. So, woe to him who makes his neighbor work for nothing and does not give him his wages. 22:13. You, Christian, in this case set for yourself the following rules. Try to reward others for the expenses already incurred for you. And if you do not have the means to reward or can only make a small reward, then sincerely ask for forgiveness. In such labors for you, your neighbor, for which there should undoubtedly be payment, even if small, if possible, agree with him in advance, so that by offering him, through ignorance, a small payment, you do not offend him and do not move from peace to unpleasant disputes, or, in the case of a lack of your funds, you could refuse his service altogether. Violent seizure of someone else's capital or property that is accidentally passed into the hands of here is what is yours. Matthew 25. 25. Should a deposit of money or property be returned after a business that was begun but did not take place? Was money mistakenly received by someone instead of a certain person? Or did someone's full capital come into our hands by chance? Was extra money given to us by someone when billing or paying? Was someone else's place built up instead of our own? Was someone else's cattle accidentally brought into the yard from the herd with our cattle? Was a valuable thing forgotten by a guest or visitor? All this, from 1,000 rubles to someone else's cane or stick, we must return to the rightful owner at his first request. As soon as the error is revealed to us that we are not the rightful owners of the money or property that we used as owners until then, we must immediately return the other person's property intact, or, if physical return is impossible, pay in money. Neither the length of possession, for example, of some piece of land, nor habit attachment to the things owned or to animate objects, for example, to an animal, do not justify us in this case. Equally, if the owner were to rudely or violently attack those things that are still in our possession, and which he has an indisputable right, we should not make this a reason for refusing him these things. On his part, only impatience or arbitrariness are allowed here. No. By not returning someone else's property after we have become convinced that it is someone else's for us, and having received the owner's statement about the property belonging to him, we undoubtedly sin. The gravity of the sin here lies, among other things, in the full possibility of correcting the matter. Someone else's capital or someone else's property remains intact in our hands, and their lawful owner, perhaps lacking only external evidence to insistently demand it from us, asks and begs us to give it to him, while our seizure, our unlawful appropriation, remains in force. Also guilty here is the appropriation of someone else's scientific or artistic work, which is the noblest and lifelong property of man. Yes, it is always necessary to protect the intellectual labor of one's neighbor, in the sense of the author, translator, first publisher, and not to dispose of his labor thoughts and the information he has collected or artistic work as if it were one's own property, and not to reproduce someone else's labor simply without using a little personal effort, without asking the consent of the original producer, without indicating the source from which the borrowing was made, deriving monetary benefits for oneself from this. The moral, soul-saving benefit here is a different matter. The original producer will be glad and grateful for it. In general, the soul is bound by the violent appropriation of someone else's property, even under plausible pretexts. How then will a person come to confession and ask for absolution for his sins if he himself does not absolve himself from someone else's capital or property? O Christian, yours and mine and property shall always be the strictest distinction for you. Searching for someone else's or someone else's inheritance, let us take possession of his inheritance. Luke 21:38. Since the heir enters into the rights of the deceased, to whom the money or estate belonged, then, first of all, the seeker of such an inheritance which does not belong to him, neither as hereditary or hereditary, that is, by inheritance of blood relationship, and not as arbitrary, that is, by the will or testament of the owner, the seeker of this kind insults the memory of the deceased. The deceased did not even think of having him as his heir, but he wants to receive a share in the remaining estate, or even to take possession of the entire estate. The deceased directly bequeathed his estate to another person, and directly, perhaps, excluded him from the inheritance. Every owner has the full right to such a will even in the last minutes of his life, and he forcibly enters into the rights of inheritance. Rather, another can voluntarily renounce an inheritance that belongs to him or is deducted for him, than to unlawfully appropriate the inheritance to himself. A seeker of another's inheritance doubly offends the legitimate heir. Thus, as soon as he declares his rights to be considered an heir, the property inherited before the case is resolved is subject to prohibition, and over time, movable property usually loses its strength and value. Then, the legitimate heir must spend in vain to protect his rights from him. But if by one means or another he succeeds in his search, then he becomes a complete robber of his neighbor under the guise of falsely applied rights. It is even worse if he takes away the inheritance not from a relative, but from some charitable institution or church, to which the deceased bequeathed all property or part of his capital. In such a case, the taking of someone else's is both material and, partly, in the spiritual sense. From a charitable institution or from a church, the seeker seizes for himself money or a house, things, and spends them, and deprives the deceased of the spiritual fruits of the donation. The deceased, distributing his property among the poor and among the churches, wanted to render a service to the Lord God, wishing that he be remembered for the repose of his soul as a donor. But the other, impudent, does not allow such beautiful fruits to ripen, encroaches on the eternal reward of the deceased for the sake of his own greed or idle and cheerful life. O reader, do not flatter yourself in your life with other people's inheritances. It is better for you to remain under a thatched roof than to live unlawfully in a rich inherited house. Selfishness from fire, flood, and, in general, in alarming circumstances of a neighbor. The Church rules this time say to consider a time that threatens all with destruction as a time of self-interest is characteristic of impious and God-hating people who have reached the extreme degree of vileness. Therefore, it is considered fair to excommunicate all such from the Church. Greek Neokes 3. A neighbor already suffers terrible losses, perhaps down to his last clothes, for example, when his house burns down, when his entire building or goods are carried away by water. And even without that, another is in anxiety and danger, for example, when his cart or sleigh is loaded in the snow, and he leaves it all on the road without any supervision in order to go and ask others for help. And even without that, someone suffers mentally and physically, for example, when he sees off his wife to the next world, and in this grief he forgets or does not have time to close his boxes with property and things. Meanwhile, dishonest people at this time take away the property of their neighbors and thus increase their losses or mental suffering. The unfortunate person barely has time to come to his senses from the alarm and sees that there is nothing around him. Everything has been stolen. Is this not robbery? Yes, here it is not simply theft, although the deed is done secretly, but robbery, because instead of his own threats and violence, characteristic of robbery, the thief here uses those threats and violence that the accident has produced. So much the worse, and so much the more justly the name impious and God-hating applies to such deceivers, who in some popular assembly suddenly shout about a fire, which, in the meantime, does not exist in order to cause an alarm, and during this alarm rob, tear jewelry, and in general, expensive things from the frightened people. Oh, impudent robbers! To profit during the alarming circumstances of your neighbor is indeed a convenient opportunity, and you hastily take advantage of this opportunity, but he who is unkind to people in their happiness, he, perhaps, will still spare the unfortunate. And you do not have even this, so your kindness to a person at any time is doubtful. Better awaken kindness and honesty in yourself. Taking advantage of a dead body, especially with desecration for the dead person, this proves, on the one hand, greed for things, and on the other, extreme disrespect for the name and face of man, as if it were not enough to rob other things and from living persons if it were desired to rob, as if the robber of the dead were not himself mortal, as if he would not in his turn be just as motionless and defenseless. Where then is it possible for a man to picture his own death, and thus come to a feeling of remorse, if not in sight of a dead person and not under the smell of a dead person? And the robber, meanwhile, rushes to easy gain, takes something for himself from a dead body. This sin is all the more terrible when robbery is combined with desecration of the dead. For example, when they throw the dead person face down, when they strip him completely or to his shirt and leave him in such a way in the open for people to see, when, finally, they dig up his grave, as if they knew that he was buried in good clothes or with some expensive things. In ancient times, robbery of the last kind, in graves, was as common as today. Dishonest people certainly take down a dead person when they find him in a field or on the street at night. Ancient gravediggers for the purpose of robbery were subjected to the most severe punishment. They were excommunicated from Holy Communion for 10 years, and with the most severe feats of penitence, for example, they had to make 200 bows every day and kneel. Basvel, 66. Oh, man, why do you touch the dead? And some grave awaits you yourself. But be careful that it does not happen that the grave does not accept you, that someone else's grave, dug up by you for robbery, suddenly collapses and crushes you. Concealment of a found item, especially when its owner is known. When you see your brother's ox or his sheep gone astray, you shall not leave them, but shall bring them back to your brother. But if your brother is not near you, or you do not know him, then you shall bring them into your house, and keep them until your brother seeks them, and then you shall return them to him. So shall you do with his donkey, so shall you do with his clothing, and so shall you do with any of your brother's lost things. Do it. 22. 1. 3. If the lost thing belongs to an enemy or ill-wisher, bring in the one who has gone astray. X. 23. 4-5. It is not difficult for anyone to lose something of his own, especially money, but does lost property really cease to be our property just because it has fallen out of our hands? And what if it is a great loss? And if it is nevertheless known that it cannot be hidden even a step further than such and such a place, or such and such hands. No. The right of a person to possess what he has lost does not cease. But they say, another person has previously lost exactly the same thing and of approximately the same value. Can he not make up for his loss with this find? 202. He cannot, according to the meaning of the church rules. They deceive themselves by holding on to someone else's found property instead of their own lost property. 203. This would mean taking offense at an offense in things, or, more precisely, taking out one's loss on the property of one's neighbor. Another says, "It is not known who lost the thing, and is it not an extraneous concern for me to find its owner?" If the find is insignificant, for example, if it is less than 10 rubles, in that case, the one who found it and does not know whose property it is can keep it without reproach of conscience. If, on the contrary, the find is very significant, it is necessary to announce it publicly at the place where it was found, or to let the authorities know, or through the printed word. It is worse when it is exposed. Then the church rules also impose a penance. 204. Even more guilty is the concealment of someone else's loss, if the one who lost it himself announces it in the newspaper, and the one who found the thing and read the newspaper, or received the newspaper news through others, keeps silent and keeps silent. Concealment is also more guilty in the case where the caretaker or watchman of those institutions or places where the thing was lost does not report the thing. In such a case, these people violate the trust of others in them. But until the owner of the found thing appears, and after the announcement the owner will hasten to appear, it should be kept intact. Do it. 22. 2. When the owner asks for the thing, it must be returned directly, or, depending on the circumstances, through the civil authorities. In a word, to conceal a find is a sin of violent appropriation of someone else's property. The one who found it and thought to take advantage of it under the pretext of his own happiness has neither the right to use nor the right to possess it. Moreover, in a Christian manner, this person must return the find without any filthy acquisitiveness. 205, not demanding a share for himself or either indicating where the lost thing is or keeping it, but providing compensation for it for the zeal of its owner. You, Christian, should always do so if someone else's loss happens to be in your hands. Do not hold it back under any disinterested pretext, for example, to pray for the one to whom it belongs. Types of theft or secret appropriation of someone else's property. Theft as a strong habit or passion. Thieves will not inherit the kingdom of God. 1 Cor 6:10. If they are denied the kingdom of heaven, then their lot is hell, eternal torment. How could a thief not stop before such a threat? Meanwhile, the unfortunate man himself gets himself into such a state that he does not want to correct himself, and often makes his correction extremely difficult. He is incited to theft by the ease of acquisition. There, you still need to work and endure. But here in 1 hour there can be profit for food or for a merry life for a whole month. He is incited to repeat theft by an intemperate or drunken life. The greatest part of thefts usually occurs from sobriety or from debauchery. A person suffering from binge drinking or drunkenness has no time to diligently earn a piece of bread for himself, and he rushes at someone else's property in order to quickly satisfy his passion and prolong its satisfaction longer. But most of all, the thief is incited to steal by its temptation. Since its essential feature as opposed to robbery is secrecy, the absence of the owner or possessor of the things, in general the absence of any violent, brutal measures and threats, characteristic of robbery and burglary. Then here, a person is flattered by his struggle with easy, for the most part, obstacles to theft. His vanity is pleased by that art, and that cunning with which he succeeds in achieving his intention, or gains the upper hand over those measures of the owner, which the owner, on his part, used to protect his property from his hands. Thus, in theft, the thief finds a kind of pleasure enjoyment, even apart from the material of his passion, that is, apart from the money or things that he steals. Sometimes he does not manage to derive any benefit or advantage from what he has stolen. He has not yet managed to put down or take away the thing, but is already exposed or detained. However, even then he is morally guilty because by this one touch of someone else's thing, he has already disturbed the peace of possession in another. It would seem that in this way an unsuccessful theft would make an impression on him against the habit of stealing. But no, he liked the very preparation for theft. He pleasantly went through a series of these sneaking up, hidden sighs, observant examinations around himself. Therefore, the very failure to steal often incites him to new attempts to steal. This time, secret theft can be compared to secret fornication. There is also a passion for theft of a special kind. These are the material aspects of theft. Whoever has become skilled at something, he is even more eager to steal it. For example, one steals iron and everything that has the character of iron, another loves to rob ready-made clothes, a third silver things, and someone had a passion for stealing diamonds. And so, in this way, a person develops a passion for theft, especially when he began to steal from childhood. And this is why there are always more prisoners in prison for theft. Out of 20 people in a cell, only one is not imprisoned for theft, and all this is a younger crowd. Then, more are always returned to prison, or are again tried for crimes other than those as for theft in its various forms. Hence the incorrigibility of the thief, hence the terrible threat of him being deprived of the kingdom of heaven. His guilt is indeed grave. For example, he mercilessly takes away from others in a short time what others have acquired over many years and with much labor. Thus, he often deprives a family man of a piece of bread. He leads others into vain expenses even before his theft. All this, the hiring of a night watch, the construction of high and solid walls, strong locks on doors and windows, iron chests and many locks, would all this be necessary if there were no thieves? It is necessary to insure one's property against a thief as against fire. Thus, he destroys the very gifts of nature in vain. He crushes, breaks much, but finds nothing to steal from himself. Burglary increases his guilt, and especially internal, or for free entry into the house or room itself, increases it because here strong obstacles are overcome. Therefore, a special effort of evil, criminal will is shown. Or a thief hides things in the forest, in a dungeon, and does not have time to take them from there because of his arrest or some other incident, so that the things remain hidden forever or only spoil without observation. After all this, it is obvious that a thief is the most evil enemy of the property and well-being of his neighbors. But, at the same time, neither the power of an enticing passion nor its heredity, as, perhaps, from parents, nor temptation and collusion on the part of others, nor poverty, nor hunger itself. Luke 15:13, 16 excuse him and will not excuse him at the last judgment. His passion, for example, and for single-item theft monomania would then only be an irresistible urge to steal, and thus would destroy the imputability or weaken the imputation of his act, if his hand could commit thefts against his will. Is he poor? But his poverty comes from theft, because if his hands can move, he could find food for himself, especially in these days, when labor is so dear almost everywhere. But if he is extremely poor and starving, he should turn for help to those who can naturally or more closely help him and not steal. The prodigal son, having brought himself to the last extremity, nevertheless chose rather to eat with the pigs, having hired himself out to tend a herd of them than to steal and feed on stolen goods. Such a case, that a father, in order to save his family from certain death by starvation, secretly took another's provisions, that is, a case of a clash of rights, although still unequal, is perhaps too rare and not repeated. It does not excuse a thief either if, while stealing, he throws away the stolen things, with which he does not know what to do. It would be another matter if he voluntarily gave up the stolen goods. In the church rules this time, his guilt is indeed softened. The one who stole, if he repents of himself and accuses himself, shall be excommunicated from the sacrament of the holy mysteries only for a year, and if he is convicted, then for 2 years. Vas Vel 61. What then, reader, shall we advise a person accustomed to stealing to correct him from his dishonest passion? We shall convey to him the most important advice from the Word of God. Let him who stole not steal again, but rather labor, EPH. 4:28. Personal labor will teach him to value the labor of others. Knowing from experience what the money or things he owns are worth, he will have a presentiment of the unpleasant situation of being robbed and will consider the thief of his property to be his enemy and a villain, and thus will not touch the property of others. An effective warning against the inclination to steal should also be to not touch someone else's things in private and generally avoid secret actions. Also, to correct this passion in its most severe development, it is good to seek well-intentioned help from others, as, for example, the Venerable Dorotheus corrected one person close to him from it. Sole Beneficial Teachings, 206 acceptance for storage or purchase of knowingly stolen goods, as well as items of questionable ownership. He who accepts stolen goods for safekeeping, or buys them, or sells them with knowledge, let us suppose that he personally does not commit theft, and in this sense is not yet a thief, not an instigator or an accomplice in theft, because he is an active participant after the crime has been committed, because his evil will is revealed when the opportunity to show it presents itself. However, his guilt in the theft is undoubted, so that a popular proverb was formed. Not the thief who steals, but the one who accepts. And indeed, if there were no acceptors and buyers of stolen goods, then most thieves would have to abandon their trade because they rarely succeed in stealing cash, and they would have difficulty each time converting stolen goods into money. Not having the opportunity or need to use them themselves, they would have to abandon them. Thus, the receivers and buyers of stolen goods, without committing the theft themselves or even assisting the thieves in it beforehand, at the same time support the theft. The receiver of stolen goods shall not receive communion for 1 year. The church rule positively punishes these people. Nomocon 47. The greater guilt is that of those of them who promise to accept the stolen goods before the theft itself, or who buy, knowing both the case of a recent theft and the person from whom the things were stolen. But buying things of dubious ownership is also a guilt. Let the seller not say that his thing is stolen, and even assure him of the opposite, even offer a receipt from himself that the thing being sold is his property. But do they hide from people with an honest sale? And the seller of stolen goods usually tries to sell one-on-one, or in a place far from his residence. Is it true that in an honest sale the thing is sold for anything, but the seller of stolen goods for some reason sells them for a pittance? In any case, the one who has accepted or bought a dubious thing cannot reassure himself about its possession as an honest and lawful owner. Therefore, it would be better for him not to buy this thing. Oh, in vain do the acceptors or buyers of stolen or dubious things reassure themselves by not participating in someone else's sin. If they did not have covetousness and love of money, they would not have decided either to accept or to buy. Failure to expose a known thief. When you see a thief, you take sides with him. Psalm 49:18. It is necessary to expose the evil thief both before the court, if the court finds him, and before those from whom he steals, and before his own conscience. Meanwhile, the guardians of public order themselves cover for him because of the money, fellow citizens or villagers out of fear that he will rob them themselves, trustees of a state or public charitable institution through their inattention or out of servility to the elder in their circle, who supposedly also knows about him and condescends. The first directly take sides with him and already increase the company of thieves. The second are mistaken in their calculation because the thief will rob them too if there is an opportunity. The third, although themselves do not commit theft, like the second, but consent to those who commit Number 132. They clearly see that, for example, some inspector or steward of a government house appropriates for himself in all parts of the economy and quickly gets rich, but they do not audit him, but do not vote against his abuses. They simply sign the account books and journals. A lesser or downright forgivable offense this time is if a close relative or a person benefited by him does not declare the thief. That is, the former do not declare out of blood disposition, and the latter out of a grateful feeling of gratitude. Code of Instructions, 128. For what reason do those who know about the thief, and even those obliged to expose him, tolerate him, or even accept him as an honest man? He himself, perhaps sinning, refers to poverty or temptations, although no excuses excuse him. And what pleasure do those who cover for him derive from their silence? He himself, perhaps, repents of his sin, and those who conceal do not even think of their guilt before God when they conceal, comforting themselves with the thought that it is not they who steal. How much evil comes from this? The treasury or a neighbor suffers losses, which meanwhile it would be possible to compensate or only prevent for a time to come. Traces of the crime are hidden or destroyed before the court. Finally, the thief distorts the judgment of conscience over himself, begins to look at his sin as something ordinary. He does not see that anyone is offended by him or turns away from him. Why should he condemn himself? Why lose courage? It is known that a person often judges what he should do, not according to his own conscience, but is tempted by the opinion of others. However, the thief should not be exposed in the same way as they sometimes do in the marketplace. In the square, they dress the person caught stealing in something special and shout and squeal about him. This is neither Christian, nor will it benefit the guilty party, and especially the guilty woman. Then the criminal loses all shame. Meanwhile, the theft, for example, by a woman, can be made insignificant. There are examples of women falling ill after such dishonor. The highest degree of the sin in question is when a thief is given refuge, where he can either enjoy the fruits of his crime, for example, count and put in order what was stolen, or hide for a while from the persecution of the legal authorities. And to knowingly and constantly give refuge to thieves means to enter into their company and fully share with them in criminal thefts. Let participation here be expressed only in a promise to accept a thief, and even the promise is not given directly, but silently, but it is already exposed by its constancy, constantly or every time they accept thieves. No, pious and pure Christian, we must all work together to prevent the development of theft and eradicate this vice in others. The Old Testament law, strict in everything, was apparently lenient in its attitude towards thieves. It pursued only the damage to the property of others that they did, and demanded compensation for losses. Acts 22:3, and did not care to punish theft as a passion, as a widespread vice, because he assumed that, for the sake of only daily bread, someone decides to take what is someone else's, Proverbs 6:30. But now it is not so with us. Thefts, concealments, appropriations are allowed out of habit, out of greed, and artificially to the highest degree. So, should we pass by, remain silent, and cover up when we see thieves? Accepting bets from a drunk or a gambler to satisfy their passion. Here we wish to speak mainly of the temporary infatuation of others with vice, for example, a drunken person or a gambler. The height of their passions passes, and they turn to their usual occupations. But how do they find themselves after this in relation to their condition or means? Here's another who is in dire need of his things, for example, in winter in warm clothes. Meanwhile, his things are simply lying in someone else's house as security for a debt. Thus, the pledgee in his person deprives his neighbor of the necessary contentment of life. Then, the debtor is left to intensify his labor in order to simultaneously satisfy the current needs for the maintenance of his family or himself alone, and to acquire money to redeem the pledge, and also especially pay for the loan in money. He is not able to bear such labor, and then, in order to satisfy his passion, he makes new pledges, and so the pledgee completely takes possession of his things, which are always more expensive than the loan money. Is this not robbing his neighbor and luring him into sin? And what about aiding him in his passion? The drunk and the gambler would inevitably stop if the pawnbrokers did not supply them with cash. Regarding the loan of money to a drunkard, it is noted, among other things, that it is difficult for anyone to find money on loan for any other extreme need, but for wine they almost always find it. What kind of benefactors are these who lend money this time? They are benefactors only to themselves and enemies to their neighbor. They seem to want their neighbor to get drunk on wine or to lose at cards. Especially low collectors in this case are those who directly sell wine in a fragmentary sale. No matter how much of his things a drunk brings them as a pawn, they willingly accept it, lending not the money itself, but the wine. Will another bring them even a holy icon or a silver cross from his chest as a pawn? And they stretch out their hand to those things. And in the hours of the fierce passion of drinking, a person really does not value anything, if only he can quench his thirst with wine. Will he bring them his last shoe? And he does not refuse that. Does he promise them payment on account of the future harvest, disposing of what he has not yet received from the Lord God? They accept this future payment from him, if only they sell their wine. Does he offer them in exchange the grain he has and other agricultural products? They agree to the exchange with particular willingness. Even the physical labor of such a person is accepted by small wine merchants as a pledge of wine. Instead of money, they pay for the work he has done with a certain measure of wine. The law justly punishes such pledgers if they are convicted of the fact that things from them are returned to the pledger and the debt is considered not worthy of payment. Code of Mandates, Art. 695-6. The law strictly prohibits the sale of wine on credit and under pledges not at all for the fiscal reasons that the monetary interests of the Treasury would be observed this time, but exclusively for moral purposes, so that public morality would not be upset, so that public order would be preserved. But this punishment for those who lend money or wine on pawn is not enough, because these people rob their neighbors doubly, both materially and morally. They sin gravely before God. Oh, how base and guilty is their profitable life. Apparently, they too are tired of honestly working and acquiring. Silent appropriation of someone else's property under the guise of a remainder. You have been faithful in that which is least mat. 25-23. Sometimes a remainder of money or materials may appear to be a remainder only at first, for example, when they are spent. It would be more shameful to return it if there is soon a shortage in it. In any case, the remainder does not belong to us, even if it was made up by our diligence or economy. Therefore, it must be returned to the owner, on whose will it depends whether to accept it for himself or give it to us as a reward. Is there no owner near to return it? Or is there no person who would have the right to count us in the materials we keep or use, and the remainder itself is insignificant? In such a case, before keeping it for ourselves, we can announce it at least to strangers. let us assume that these persons do not have the right to allow you to possess someone else's property. But here, the absence of secrecy, of concealment from oneself is important. It is important not to give ourselves a reason to allow secrecy, concealment, external, in both cases, which is generally a sign of theft and can partly develop theft in a person. However, Christian, it is permissible for me and you sometimes and silently to use for ourselves or for others an insignificant remainder of someone else's money or things. It is permissible if we have already established the character of not taking anything that belongs to someone else. In such a case, we stand above petty fears and petty abuses precisely because we act in the spirit of the freedom of Christ Gal. 5. 1. Secret eating, as well as secret drinking, especially wine. There is secret eating that is well-intentioned and innocent, so as not to cause confusion among others, not to tempt anyone. Thus, the Apostle Peter hid in food among the Antiochian Christians from the Gentiles in front of the Jews who came to Antioch. Of course, we are not talking about this secret eating and drinking, but firstly, about that which happens for the most part from something taken secretly. They eat and drink secretly from the hosts or owners of some food or drink, 207. Thus, here, there can also be a deprivation of a neighbor in what he has prepared for himself to eat and drink, which means depriving him of an essential need. Then, secrecy, this time, is allowed even with one's own food or drink. They do not want to share with others, to invite to the table a person who has not yet eaten, and therefore they hide, and only at the wrong time they drink or eat, and therefore hide so as not to be slandered. For example, they drink tea early on Sunday morning. This kind of secret eating or drinking, in addition to the reasons that prompt it, and which sometimes increase its sanity, sometimes decrease it, cannot but disturb the conscience of a Christian. Thus, it requires self-condemnation before God. But secret drinking of wine is especially guilty. It can be either at a party when, for example, the host, who has the right to treat, turns away, or in one's own house so as not to appear to others as a drinker. Private secret drinking of wine is very capable of developing passion and even binge drinking, especially in a woman. As in general, a hidden vice develops faster due to the fact that, among other things, it does not meet with opposition from other well-intentioned people. And so you, Christian, remembering, among other things, Eve's secret eating of the forbidden fruit in paradise, avoid secret eating and secret drinking that is dishonest for gain or only selfish or for the satisfaction of passion. Burglary during all-night vigils or in church. The first case of property offense to a neighbor is that the thief goes to steal at night. In general, the guilt of night theft increases, because the night thief, taking advantage of the darkness of the night, acts more boldly and carries off more. Thus, due to his audacity, a greater defense is allowed against him than during the day. There is no responsibility before the conscience, and for severe blows to him. X. 22:23. Invading a house during the all-night vigil, he goes against the defenseless, that is, against the elderly or children who have remained guards of the house. Consequently, he goes to take more, and really takes more, if he cannot carry off everything. This is the very peculiarity of the guilt of one who steals from houses during the all-night vigil. Then there follows a religious moral side to his offense. Because of the thief, an extra person remains at home and does not go to church, for example, to stand for the Passion, to the all-night vigil on the Annunciation, to Matins on Christmas and Easter, does not go against his will, so as not to find his rooms and drawers empty later. But, and having come to church, a person who has no family worries in spirit that a thief will break into his house or apartment and steal everything, and consequently does not pray with full attention. Faint-hearted people, having suffered a real loss during their stay in church, grumble and are annoyed at the church service itself, which became the cause of their ruin. Thus, the one who steals from house to house during the all-night vigil causes a loss to his neighbor, both material and religious ecclesiastical. In itself, he deeply insults the Lord's holidays. The brighter the holiday for others, the darker it is for him because of his black deeds. As for theft in church, here the moral side of the offense is so important that there is no need to talk about the material insult to his neighbor. Where virtue is taught, where there are witnesses around, like the saints of God in their faces, where the Lord God is present with His grace and glory, where people pray and repent of their sins, there a thief or a whole party of predators steal, tear things off others. And they allow this mainly in moments of special tenderness and reverence of the pilgrims. For example, when everyone approaches the cross, the analogian icon venerates the relics or the miraculous image. Thus, predators in the church, even if not of church but of worldly things, do not allow the pilgrim to calmly pour out his soul before the shrine, make him worry every minute about money and other things that are with him. Thus, having robbed him, they leave an unpleasant impression on him after he has fulfilled his sacred duty or long-standing vow, and they repel others from visiting the shrines. And by all this they diminish the dignity of the shrines themselves or the honor of the temple or chapel where the shrine is kept. Oh, if only these impudent predators, realizing their grave guilt, would hurry to the church only to pray and repent of their sins before God, to express before their spiritual father their firm determination not to steal again, neither in the church nor anywhere. Sacrilege, you commit sacrilege. Rom 2:22. The sin of sacrilege distinguishes A. Church things, property, B. Things consecrated and used in worship, and C. Those that belong to the Eucharist. D. Finally, the gifts of Christ and holy myrrh. Church things can be stored and therefore stolen, not only in the church but also outside it, in chapels, in sacristies, in storerooms, in pillars with icons. However, an icon from home, temporarily located in the church, for example, during a 40-day commemoration for the deceased, mugs at the church for the benefit of the poor, or for charitable use do not constitute church property. To steal something from church things, for example, candles that have not yet been placed in front of the icons, money from a dish or under lock and key, from materials such as bricks, sheets of iron, firewood. This is only theft, but a theft that goes beyond the series of other thefts. Then, and only temporarily, to use any of the church things, for example, carpets, table candlesticks, ordinary dishes and linen, towels, to use in one's house or apartment, not for prayerful and liturgical use, or not on the occasion of some spiritual holiday gathering, but only in exchange for worldly things that could be borrowed from worldly houses. All this also constitutes a considerable sin. According to the rules of the holy apostles, the thief of church wax and oil must return to the church 5 times more. Rule 72. Yes, things brought as a sacrifice to the temple and already consecrated for liturgical use, for example, candle ends, icons and icon frames, censers, vestments, liturgical books, except for the altar gospel, can rather be sold per wear or because of their access for such sacred use, and only some, like metal for example, with alteration, with recasting, given for a fee perhaps, and for ordinary worldly needs than to go for worldly use and to a worldly home. But to deliberately steal from the church what has been consecrated by the divine service and church use means to commit the sin of Judas, who in his intention already stole the precious myrrh poured out by Mary on the most pure feet of the Savior John 12. 3. 9. Finally, to steal from the altar or from the sacristy the gospel, the cross, the chalice, the tabernacle, the antimension, the holy myrrh, the gifts of Christ themselves. or even just the veil or shroud from the altar. To steal one of these holy things also from a short-term storage place, for example, from the priest's house, or to use any of them in domestic or secular use, excluding, of course, the myrrh and the holy gifts. This is considered sacrilege in the strict sense. A sacrilege is one who steals anything sacred from the church, from the holy altar, from the vessels of the church, says the Nomo Canon, Rule 50, 183. Such a sacrilege is subject to a 15-year penance, Gregory of Nyssa 8. But Belshazzar, having dared to use the church vessels for his feast, was punished first with the most alarming fear, then with unexpected death Dan. 5. The gravity of sacrilegious theft increases when it is combined with an insult to the sanctuary. They open the royal doors, overturn the vessel with myrrh, bloody the floor and walls of the temple from beatings to the defenders of the sanctuaries, after which it is necessary to consecrate the church and sacred things. Oh, cannot the hand of only the unbaptized be raised to steal such things? Is it not enough for a greedy robber to rob worldly houses and things? Does this not mean, for example, stealing a cross, a chalice, a spoon to rob Christ himself? Oh, terrible predators! But grant them, Lord, repentance before the end. In a broad or spiritual sense, sacrilege is also considered to include using for a sacrament a substance or quality other than that required by church rules. For example, serving alcoholic, sour, thin, cheap wine for a mass, or black, stale prosphora. All of these are frequent abuses and arbitrariness of church elders. Soft and better-shaped prosphora will be sold to a layman for commemoration, while stale and worse ones are deliberately chosen for the liturgy and the Eucharist. Performing sacraments without authorization, priests serve and undertake to baptize, confess, and marry schismatics, while in orthodoxy it is the one who is under legal prohibition. Admitting to the holy mysteries an unworthy person, clearly for everyone, and, in essence, Matt. 6. Sacrilege, simony, thy money perish with thee. Repent of that sin of thine. Acts 8 hours, 20 minutes, and 22 seconds. Thus it was said to the sorcerer Simon, who for money wanted to receive from the apostles the highest spiritual gift of communicating the Holy Spirit to others by the laying on of hands. From this came the name of the sin simony. The same sin is repeated even now. When for a certain sum of money, or desiring special honor for themselves, they ordain someone to the rank of priest or deacon. When for money, which is directly shown or promised, or only expected, they absolve someone of sins. When, through excessive faith in money, they acquire for themselves a part of the holy relics, or only the covers from the custodian of these shrines, to use this time a gift or a monetary payment to an unbaptized person in whose hands the shrine would be, does not constitute a sin. When a certain sum is determined, and without bringing it, they do not even allow one to venerate the relics and the miraculous icon. The prophet Daniel answered sternly when he was offered silver and high honor for the manifestation of the gift of clairvoyance. Let your gifts remain with you, and give the honor to another Dan. 5:17. The cathedral rules also thunder at those who, on the one hand, buy, and, on the other, sell grace, which, however, is not sellable, 208. They either deprive one of a sacred office for this sin, or subject one to anathema, 209. It is criminal here that the spiritual is valued by the material. The priceless is given for dust. What was received for free is communicated not for free, Matt. 10. 8. That there is a trade in the sacred on both sides. The guilt of this mortal sin extends also to those who only indirectly, but nevertheless consciously assisted 210, and equally, the grave guilt is whether the money will be accepted in advance or after 211. Oh, how terribly this domestic and base passion of avarice carries into the very sanctuary of God. Abuse of donations from others that are made for some godly, holy cause. He said this not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. John 12:6. Here, the religious feeling of one's neighbor is deeply offended. Everyone who, out of sincere zeal, donates to the church or to missionary work, or to some charitable institution, or on the occasion of some special prayer, for example, a service, everyone wants his donation to reach its destination, to bring its benefit, and even to be used not without intelligent frugality. This heartfelt desire of the donor is all the more honorable, because sometimes he donates not from his surplus, but by denying himself some needs. He donates due to lack of money and things or his own works as soon as he can, for example, books, bread, linen, etc. Meanwhile, those people into whose hands these donations have been entrusted for transfer to where they should go, or for unaccountable use at their discretion, or for gradual spending, let us assume, and with a record, those people use other people's donations not for the glory of God, but for their own benefit. For example, they keep for themselves, under some pretext or without any thought, money that was entrusted to them for candles, for a prayer service, for the purchase of something for the church, for distribution to the poor. They use materials or things for their own purely selfish or other personal purposes, for example, spiritual books that are intended for the poor or parish schools. And if they do not use everything that was entrusted to them for a certain sacred purpose, carelessly, unproductively for spiritual work, for example, in missionary work, in a word, as if it were only someone else's property for themselves. O thieves of their neighbor's holy donations! Imagine the good and innocent hope of the donor, how he thinks to be worthy of God's mercy by virtue of his donation, how he supposes that his donation has long been used, whom he has appointed to use it, how spiritual fruits grow from his donation. Meanwhile, all this is not yet, in fact, all this, behold, you have detained in your hands. Hurry to correct your abuses, if you can by deed itself, and if not by deep repentance before God. Unjust appropriation of another's property by fraud, making a counterfeit coin, or just knowingly selling it. Whose image and superscription is this? They say to him. Caesar's Matthew 22:20. 21. Yes, the king himself has the right to command the production of money, and the state as a whole is entitled to the income from it. Thus, the production of counterfeit coin, even if it is made of metal and materials of the same value, constitutes theft from the king himself and the whole state. Ways are open to everyone to work for the acquisition of wealth. Meanwhile, by the production of counterfeit coin and banknotes, which have their value in general circulation, others, without working, want to suddenly get rich at the expense of the state. They want to reap where they have not sown or worked. They do not make any transformation in the coin by their own labor in its appearance, but only copy the work of the king and thereby insult the work itself. The main thing is, by making money, these people weaken the state at its foundation. They want to appropriate for themselves a part of the state's power through rapid enrichment. The state, therefore, justly stands up for its rights. For example, it persecutes even those who, although they do not take any part in the work of counterfeit coinage, but know about it reliably, and meanwhile do not bring it to the attention of the government. 212. It also persecutes the mere accident of receiving counterfeit money. If someone, let us say, received a coin in good faith, not knowing about its counterfeit nature but regrets losing his own, and therefore hastens to pass it on to another under the guise of real 213. Oh, if the counterfeiters or translators of counterfeit money, before they were brought to justice, had come to their senses and voluntarily hastened to reveal to the government their accomplices who were not yet known. then they would have provided the means to discover and stop the criminal actions of others for the benefit of the state, and they themselves would have been pardoned by the government. Their names would even have been kept secret, at least until the public examination of the case. Illegal sale of gold, as well as the same work from it of things better than thousands of gold and silver. Psalm 119, 72 is said in the Word of God about spiritual gifts. Consequently, among material gifts, or invisible nature, gold is the first treasure. To whom, if not the whole state, should this treasure initially belong? Yes, the state already leaves to others both the extraction of gold and the trade in it in parts. But they will say, is not the happiness of the man who accidentally finds a whole nugget of gold or silver, or a piece of some precious stone, for example, a diamond? Let happiness be happiness. But as every find must be presented to its owner, so everyone knows the owner of treasures from the bowels of the earth. The owner in this case is the treasury. It does not leave without reward the one who accidentally finds a piece of gold or a precious stone, but it does not allow this man to directly sell the find, which he would sell for a trifling price. Gold can be classified this time among those things which are common to all, like light or air, and which no one alone can claim as his own. Just as in a family, all have the same right to look at a particular jewel or to use that jewel, so the members of the entire state family are equal in their rights to the precious. Where will there be justice if one person takes possession of the gold? They will also say, another person sought the gold or worked it. But another person also made efforts to find it. How is the first more worthy that he alone and silently, can take possession of what he has found? And if the personal labor of working gold is recognized as the labor that is used to turn gold into ingots, then this labor means nothing compared to the value of the metal in nature. After this, those who produce and sell any gold items without established hallmarks, who melt gold and silver not in an assay office, who use only small amounts of silver for items without a legal hallmark, and who also pass off bronze and the like as gold items, also act criminally. So, reader, gold cannot be compared to berries in the field, which anyone can pick and eat. Yes, sometimes, for example, in gardens, even berries are not allowed to be picked. Forged documents in terms of money or property, as well as concealment of genuine documents. An example of such forgeries is seen in the Gospel in the steward of the house. This man allowed his master's debtors to write false promissory notes, and he himself counterfeited each of the notes. For example, he said to someone who owed 100 measures of wheat, "Write 80. And now there are people who act the same way in matters of money or property. But, unfortunately, they still want to justify themselves with the example of this man, because it is said in the Gospel, and the Lord praised the steward Luke 16:7-8. In vain, the praise here does not refer to concealment, which can in no way be praised from a moral point of view, but, in fact, to self-care. The steward was concerned with appeasing the debtors of the master, in order to then find refuge and protection with them, that is, in the event of his removal from office. That he acted even now not as it would be permissible for anyone to act in difficult circumstances of life, we see from his own view of his actions and then from outside testimony about his actions. He himself only, having called his Lord's debtors, each one separately Luke 16. 5 forced them to write false documents. That is, he did business with each of the debtors only separately or face-to-face. Consequently, he was afraid that his transaction would be discovered, and an outside voice calls him unjust Luke 16. 9. Even after he'd gotten out of a dangerous situation by such dexterity, you, Christian, reject both in your soul and in deed all these tricks that human self-interest invents in order to take possession of someone else's and only by means of papers that have the dignity of money or grant the right to property, 214 sale, or manufacture of things that can be sold and manufactured only by special permission and right. Thus, for example, in pharmacies they sell real poisons, or only strong substances not in the form, or not to the persons in which and to whom they are allowed to sell. They sell the same poisonous substances and others, who have no right to do so by law. Some produce tobacco illegally and have other factories, for example, rationing, without legalized permissions and certificates. The guilt of these people is that they harm the interests of others. Others pay for the rights, and they, under other people's rights, sell and sell even more than others, because they can give in more or take advantage of people's weakness to rush into prohibited purchases. Oh, producers of prohibited sales or production. You have only one concern: to make a huge profit. But you do not think about the fact that the thing that you secretly sell or make, for example, gunpowder, can be terribly abused by someone else. How many terrible, irreparable disasters this same gunpowder, in connection with fashionable and widespread revolvers, now causes. Secret evasion of duties, and from my secret things cleanse me. Psalm 18, 3. Thus, for example, at the customs they simply transport or buy things, although permitted by law, but subject to duties. There, passengers transport goods or things unpaid in secret, for example, in their carriages, cars, or near them, for example, sewn into clothing. They send by mail under the guise of government property, therefore without payment, their private and personal, for example, a package, a parcel. Often this is allowed by officials. At the post office they already value something sent with an excessively small figure and with their own means, in order to pay less in insurance fees, or they send again in secret places of the luggage box something that is subject to a special duty. Then they value the income from their factory or building many times less, so that the legal tax on them is not increased. And how many cases are there where they easily and elusively evade the prescribed duties? But here the Christian must show that he acts according to his conscience, that he does not wait for outside insistence or reminders to pay what is required by the customs regulations. He remembers that, even if he manages to save a little, he will lose a lot in another place, because he did not pay the customs with consciousness, and this evasiveness of his remains a secret only for people, but it is open before the face of the all-seeing God. He does not justify himself this time by the fact that he already has many such needs in his domestic and social life, for which he can in no way do without payments, if not at the present time, then later. But if he is in need of much, even if for everyone now the food supplies in life are dear, then he believes the original cause of all this to be nothing other than human sin, which gave birth to and maintains scarcity on earth. However, pious Christian, here too, you and I can, in the spirit of the freedom of Christ. Psalm 18:13, without fear or bewilderment, sometimes evade a small duty. We can allow ourselves this when we are in special need of not paying the duty. All the valid exceptions in the general law cannot be counted, especially when we are performing such a useful work, compared to which the unpaid duty is like a drop of water in the sea, and which, meanwhile, could be delayed. Theft of another's property together with others, or through joint deception. Thus, for example, an estate under interdict or guardianship is sold at auction, and those appointed for sale enter into a deal with one particular buyer in order to exclude others. And even more often the buyers themselves previously agree among themselves in favor of one, having taken payment from the latter. In the first case, the loss is to the honest side of the buyers, and in the second to the one whose property is sold at auction. Thus, the workers of some factory, having agreed among themselves, come to the owner and ask for an increase in their pay without any need, only because there is an occasion, a pretext for asking. Even worse, in a factory or plant, together with the closest overseers, they conceal the wealth of the manufacturer, for example, iron. Special members of a trading society, partnership, or company divide among themselves some monetary income or part of the property at a loss to other members. Submitting, as usual, to others a report, for example, an annual one, they falsely assure that it was impossible to get a large profit from trade or that such and such things were spent or damaged. In a similar way, special members of some private but capital construction divide among themselves a part of the building money or materials, and the inspectors and stewards of some institution, after a general agreement among themselves, enjoy the savings on the consumed items. Peasants in a whole transport, or more than 9 people, go to other people's forest dachas and there destroy the forest or only spoil it, for example, by grazing their cattle, notching to extract juice. The forest officials and foresters of these dachas, receiving a good reward from them in money, also jointly indulge them. All such thefts by means of joint deception, and how many of them there are in this world, are especially guilty because they show openness the impudence of theft or friendly theft. In view of them, an honest person involuntarily asks himself the question, in whom, after this, can one have public confidence if a whole partnership, a whole institution steals? In relation to the owners of money or things from whom they steal, in addition to the material insult to them, this is the main thing allowed in such theft: deception. This or that is taken from them not by a fight, but for the most part amicably and peacefully. The owner is sometimes so deceived that he himself agrees to hand over his money or things to the thieves, believing that they have a certain right to do so. No, for you, Christian, it should be repugnant to participate in such a division of what was appropriated by deception. It is said in the Word of God, "Blessed is the man who has not walked in the counsel of the ungodly." Psalm 1. 1. Incorrect weight, inaccurate measure and shortage of money upon delivery. The ancient prophets rebuked traders for all this, to make the measure small, and to deceive with false scales. Amos 8, 5, cf. Micah 6:11. This time, the Savior raised the moral requirements. Good measure that is not at all reduced, full. Pressed because by pressing down loose material, for example fluff, one can give it out in a measure and more. Shaken down because if you shake, for example, rye, oats, then more will fit into the measure. Overflowing, for example, oil level with the edges of the vessel. Into your bosom that is so full a measure that it remains to put it already in the bosom. Luke 6:38. After this, is it not contrary to Christian conscience to those who short weigh, short measure, and short count money, taking advantage of either the trust of buyers who will not overweigh or remeasure, or their inexperience, for example, when selling goods to children? Moreover, some, with the intent to deceive, have weights or measures of a smaller, non-specified size, and also make smaller measures in order to measure something bulky, for example, firewood, stone, a boundary, and sometimes even add artificial weight to the things being sold. For example, they put tree branches or clumps of snow in hay, and let tea get damp or surround it, like sugar, with unnecessary papers, so that it has more weight. Finally, some not only do not remember about the shaken measure, but in contrast, shake their goods so that they seem larger in appearance, and in order to increase the price for them. Is not all this an appropriation of another's property by means of petty deception? No, traders and sellers. You can always add more, and in any case not reduce your measure than the buyer can add to his payment, because the cash money that he offers you is considered more valuable than your things. Although he sometimes pays a small amount, it is still money. Concealing defects in what is being sold or exchanged, the following is allowed here: A. Also deception, which is all the more offensive to the buyer because perhaps the buyer would not have regretted paying more if only the item had been free of damage or the animal, purchased or exchanged, free of defects. B. loss to the buyer or the person who accepted the exchange, because these persons must again spend money on those things in which they made a mistake, and without which, meanwhile, they cannot do. And C. Malicious acquisition. They take clean money and hand over something rotten and damaged, or they themselves receive a good thing in exchange and offer a bad one. Buying and selling is not a game, but a kind of contract, or only a short-term rapprochement between two persons. The seller is glad to see the buyer, but the buyer also seems to consider himself one of the sellers for a moment. How much hypocrisy and false excitement of feelings on the one hand, remorse and vexation on the other, if a defect in the thing sold is concealed and, moreover, if the full price for the thing is taken, as if the buyer had entered the wrong country when he sees himself, after his purchases, deceived on all sides and punished with losses. As if the seller also wants to remain in the wrong country, concealing from this and that and a third buyer the defects in his goods. Naturally, the latter loses the trust of previous buyers and must expect new ones, or ones who do not know him at all, if he wants to deceive and cause losses to these as well. Unstable trade, and at the same time, an unclean conscience. The habit of talking about one's needs, or feigned poverty. If indeed the needs were far from being covered by the means of existence which another receives, then even this frequent talk about needs is out of place. Perhaps only a friend or special benefactor would volunteer to help him, but for others his speeches are nothing but boredom. Thus, when he complains every time about his needs, he does not receive any benefit for himself, but rather disturbs his spirit even more. Some will certainly oppose him with their own needs, while others will not believe him at all. No. Let this man rather pray to the Lord God that the Lord would help him to live the necessary time than to conduct his conversation before everyone in such a way as to complain about the insufficiency of his support. But there really is a feigned poverty. Some wealthy people say that they are spending their last money on their own support, or have nothing at all to spend. If they suffer some loss in their household or a decrease in their income from their position, or a small loss of money, they complain so much that it seems as if no one else has such a misfortune as theirs. If the conversation touches on the high cost of something or the years to come of their life, they express the fear that they will probably have to go about the world. What empty talk! These people, so to speak, steal from themselves. They have enough and complain about their shortcomings. They talk about their debts, which only according to their calculations they have not paid, but they have even more debtors who are both faithful and reliable. Usually they talk about their needs either to those who are ready to ask them for money, so as not to give money to those who ask for it, in order to refuse in advance, or to wealthy people, in order to profit from the latter themselves. They often shame themselves before society. If money is stolen from them, then their poverty, which they have covered themselves with until then, is exposed before everyone, or death befalls them, and everyone learns of their condition. If these people are directly addicted to money or money lovers, then they endure the role of the poor even less to the end. Thus, for example, they are asked for a loan, and at first they answer that they have no money at all, that they themselves are looking for a person from whom they can borrow. But as soon as they are told about good collateral or interest, they immediately change their look and tone of speech. They say that they have some money left over or saved for something, that they are perhaps ready to lend, that they were also, it seems, acquainted with the father of the petitioner, and so on. These people, judging by themselves, do not trust the needs and poverty of others. They like to exalt only other people's income or means of living and reduce the figure of their own means. But they can no longer be trusted in their needs because they do not make expenses, do not give alms, do not even think of any donation, and have not had any losses. Finally, they are ungrateful and liars before God. God gave them, and they pretend to be poor. There, in a box, they have banknotes or cash, and, let's say, people do not come to check their condition. Only God knows everything, but they are ready to swear that they have nothing. Or their money is given to private individuals for interest, and that means they have no money at home. And yet they, as if in good conscience, reveal that they do not have a single kopeck in the whole house. As if the money that they have given to strangers is no longer their property, and as if they cannot borrow or spend it on account of this money, or in general, in the sure hope of receiving some kind of money. They have sufficient capital in comparison with others, and the figure of this capital is constantly in their memory, and they present themselves as non-covetous, as unmercenary. It is pleasant to form such an idea about oneself in people. Imagine themselves as babies who don't even know how to count money. Thus, we have enlarged on the habit of speaking about one's needs, precisely because by this habit people nourish the vice of avarice. They are avaricious or greedy this time in words. Moreover, the habit of responding to the lack of money has now become common, and the powerful rich say, "Where can we get the means?" As if now the title of rich no longer exists, and as if someone could forcibly take money from the rich if they revealed that they had wealth. But you, Christian, better remember the words of Holy Scripture. Having food and clothing, we shall be content with these. 1 Tim. 6. 8. Making a fortune by feigning beggary. When there is no strength at all to feed oneself, one must accept alms only as needed, and not in excess. Meanwhile, others, having received the first 5 or 10 alms, perhaps out of genuine need, then decide to give other alms without any need. Why? Because, seeing money in their hands, they begin to get used to money, that they have found an easy way to acquire money. We are not saying that these people abuse alms for a drunken life or to indulge their laziness like other beggars 2:15. No, they may be sober and partly engaged in business, but they abuse alms in a different way. With alms money, they develop and nourish in themselves the passion of avarice, just as Judas developed and nourished in himself a passion at the alms box for the benefit of the community of Christ. Thus, these people accumulate considerable sums of money, as, for example, in the capitals. When they are refused assistance on the grounds that there are no small ones, they obliviously say, "We can change it." What can be said about the guilt of these rich beggars? Accepting alms from the hands of rich people, they transfer to themselves that which could increase the alms of the truly poor, and more often they steal by deception from poor people who give to them, themselves having families and suffering from need. Although these people do not offer them silver coins, they give them at almost every step, and rubles are made up of small coins. So, woe to you, beggars' money lovers, if you do not hasten to turn your alms to alms for the beggars 216. On the frugal use of one's own and others' property, using someone else's property without asking, and also without any frugality. Everyone values their property, especially that which they have acquired through personal and hard labor. This is where we want our property to be left alone, to be respected. Moreover, they want it to be protected even when for some reason they themselves cannot protect it, for example, when they are away. But many people have this desire only for themselves, or to themselves. It seems that another person has a free thing, or that he has many things of this kind, and they use someone else's thing. Such use of someone else's is allowed from a cup or a spoon to the placement of a whole house. They say, nothing has been lost from the thing, and it is returned to the owner intact. So, but why violate the right of ownership? Why not ask the owner for permission? Or could it happen that he himself, at the same time, is forced to use his thing? Then, naturally, there will be a stop in his activities, a stop also in the sense that sometimes Not knowing who has the thing, he spends time looking for it near him. No, to the extent that we use someone else's, we steal this someone else's for ourselves. But if, they say, you ask the owner about his thing, he will refuse because of his stinginess. Meanwhile, the thing is in dire need, for example, in winter for warm clothing, in time of famine for bread or some kind of food supplies. In this case, that is, to preserve health from obvious danger, or for the integrity of one's life and that of one's family. In this one case, one can take someone else's without asking. Although, even here, the rights are not as equal as if two people were holding onto the same board on the river and each needed a board to save his life. Nevertheless, the feeling of self-preservation must prevail over the shame of using someone else's without asking or secretly. This act is close in its meaning to the necessary defense against the enemy of life. Christ the Savior did not blame his disciples when the disciples, passing through the sowing fields and languishing from hunger, plucked other people's ears of grain. Matt 12, 1-4. But beyond this need, to use someone else's without asking would be a relaxation of one's morality. Once, it is possible to satisfy hunger with someone else's bread, but to steal in order to feed oneself, for example, due to a lack of work, is an obvious crime. In any case, those who have used someone else's property without asking should make it a rule for themselves. If its owner is known or is nearby, let them notify the owner at least later in time, in order to honor the other person's right of ownership. Others, however, add a new guilt to the silent, temporary possession of someone else's property. They do not take care of someone else's property while they own it. They allow such lack of care in everything from a book to a carriage or a workhorse. Sometimes things of the same kind lie side by side, their own and someone else's, and so they take care of the first, but do not spare the latter. They leave one completely unused out of economy and use the other without mercy. Is there any respect and fidelity in relation to someone else's property here? It is also dishonest to use for one's own needs such things that are taken only for safekeeping, and also not to take care of what is given for support. Here, there was already, in a way, an agreement. One entrusted his property, and the other accepted it. What was accepted must be returned intact, with the exception of accidental loss of things, which falls on their owner. Honest Christian soul, let the owner of those things that are in your safekeeping or for some reason close to you live in a distant place. Let not a ray of sunshine reach their owner with such news that his things are being used and not taken care of. But remember that the all-seeing Lord is near Psalm 118, 151, and therefore do not use someone else's without his knowledge, or to the detriment of the owner. Not warning one's neighbor about losses or damages that he himself does not foresee. In trade, in any kind of building or purchase, another goes straight to losses and damages, because he does not foresee it due to his inexperience or short-sightedness. Thus, pity for our neighbor and compassion for his waste of labor or money prompt us to warn him. Meanwhile, seeing all this, some of us remain silent out of indifference, others maliciously, for example, in homogeneous trade, and others, and in the hope that they will not get anything at a cheap price or for free from this person, just as someone is glad to use the clothes that were left on the shore by a drowned man. Shameful self-interest. However, it is necessary to warn about losses, not so that one will benefit, and everyone else will lose. For example, the price of bread will soon rise, and the grain merchant, having received such news, completely suspends his sale, while others have no grain in stock or little. Angry, offended by such warnings, for example, young people. If significant losses or damages threaten them, and from these losses damage to the property of many people may occur, it is necessary to endure vain anger, especially since the angry ones will undoubtedly be grateful to us later on. Reader, when you suffer great losses in something through ignorance and feel discontent in your soul with those who knew and did not warn you, do not allow others in a similar case to remain with the same feeling of discontent in relation to you. Excessive prices for craft work and art. The reason for artisans to raise their prices is the vain and luxurious consumers of their work, for example, clothing, shoes, but it is not necessary to take too much even from wealthy people. Meanwhile, a person of average means may also be forced into the same expensive craftsman. Where will the latter get the means to pay him excessive prices? What will he have left for his family and for the maintenance of the house after one or two things that he paid with sighs to the expensive craftsman? The craftsman will not even think about it. He only increases the price for his work year after year, taking advantage of the fact that he has managed to take more from some people. In this way, he gets rich at the expense of others, indulges in luxury, and already begins to live not as a modest craftsman, but as a merchant or nobleman, posing as educated, without being educated. But sometimes he also harms his own fortune. In order to get rid of his heavy prices for his craft, they try to order his work from another city or place. Yes, this is a real burden for the people excessively expensive craftsmen and craftswomen. The saints also brought their handicrafts to the market to sell, but they were very careful not to take too much. Some of them did not even count the money they were given for things. As for the artists, the excessive prices for their works make it inaccessible to purchase their works, and meanwhile, what for example is more necessary than icons, and diminish the honor of their noble labor. Have mercy, craftsmen and craftswomen. How much do you raise your fees? Meanwhile, as for another thing that comes out of your hands, there is nothing to look at, it is so small. You should thank God that He gave you the ability for craft or art X. 31:3-5, and serve your neighbor with your craft, without burdening your neighbor. You want to acquire for yourself not so much the quantity of labor, always beloved by God, as the quality, that is, you want to work less and earn more. No, it is better to make life easier for the people, and not to burden it, because you yourselves in other cases need the labor of your neighbor. Because your high cost of labor, by the way, forces others to run away and get married, so as not to grieve with their family. Then, for example, they dress themselves with. And to keep someone from getting married directly or indirectly is a great evil. Moderate, as much as possible, your payments for craft labor, poor workmanship of a thing due to fashion or negligence. They all trust in their hands, and everyone is wise in his own work, it is said of artisans, sir. 38:36. Self-interest also makes some craftsmen care only about the appearance or style of things in order to attract a buyer, and not about their strength. For the sake of attractiveness, or more accurately for a new design of a thing, they sacrifice its convenience. For example, chairs are really neat, but there is nowhere to sit on them because they are airy. No, the wisdom of artisans and artists should consist, first of all, in the fact that the thing they make to order or for sale is strong, and then more appropriate to its use. Old things are distinguished by their strength, although in comparison with modern ones, they are less beautiful to the eye. This means that in the past, craftsmen did not spare the material for the things they produced, and were diligent in their work, and they especially cared about the convenience of using things. The present-day ones, on the contrary, try to please the vanity of the public with their art. But in this way they partly degrade their work. Then, they do not protect the fortune of their neighbors, who, instead of one, as before, must hold 2 or 3 things. Finally, and again, they harm their own interests, because the publicity of someone's weak work leads customers or buyers away from his works. Oh, artisans, spare your neighbor's money so that he will not have the need to start the same things again in a short time, especially since his life requires all sorts of things. Work so that he will use your thing longer and remember you with honor. careless storage of one's property, and hence the opportunity for others to easily steal it. He would have watched and not suffered his house to be broken into. Luke 12:39. Yes, he who does not guard his money or property in one way or another opens the door to the thief and is guilty of much. He voluntarily deprives himself of money or property, scattering it all and not inquiring from time to time about the safety of his property. And he does this not because he has tested the fidelity of those around him, but out of sheer carelessness. And, having lost things, he worries himself and worries others, both to find what was lost, and to vainly suspecting both of these and others of theft. At the same time, he gives occasion to some to begin stealing, like young people from whom he does not even shut out money, and to others to practice their favorite theft. Things are sometimes not a pity because they are insignificant, but it is a pity that they are stolen, and that they are stolen, as usually happens, by close and domestic persons. However, to have keys to all sorts of cabinets, and to constantly carry a pack of these keys with you, to leave account of every kopeck or thing in the house, this insults the honor of those from whom one is so guarded, and sometimes even incites them to use their vigilance against vigilance, their cunning against cunning. Thus, moderation is required in the preservation of one's property. Reader, although locks and guards show the unnaturalness of human life, there's nothing to be done. Against shameless theft or refined burglary, one must arm oneself with permitted measures. This will be, in a way, a fight against sin, luxury, and extravagance. He was clothed in purple and fared sumptuously every day. Luke 16:19. Luxury consists in spending much and in excess on one's clothing, on the daily table, on dinners and evenings, on servants, on outings, on decorating a house or apartment, on remuneration by salary or separate payment of someone, and for something beyond any need, for the sake of mere foppery. For luxury, means, and a constant increase of means or income are necessary. Otherwise it is unthinkable. Let it not exhaust the whole capital of the rich man or exceed someone else's greater salary. Let people spend their own, and not someone else's, in luxury. However, why should one spend so much on himself as would suffice for the maintenance of many? She who eats abundantly is condemned in the word of God. 1 Tim 5. 6. Why, for example, these bottles of wine at dinners, paid for with many rubles and drained in 1 hour? Why burn dozens of candles when 3 or 4 would be enough? Or why heat a huge house when no one lives in it? After all, this means wasting vital materials. How many similar examples of luxury can be cited? But luxury is even more guilty when it eats up all available resources, even forcing one to go into debt. Then, a person especially does not have wherewithal to impart to the needy, EPH 4:28 that is, he violates that commandment of the Word of God which pertains to our use of the remains or surplus of our wealth, 2:17. Then, this is where such a pursuit of money comes from, such calculation in every matter for a large sum of money. And this has a painful effect on the general well-being of the people. Because of this, everyone tries to increase the payment for his labor or goods. Indeed, from the servant to the official and the scholar, why is everyone now so preoccupied with this one thing, how to increase their salary? Because, in fact, life has become expensive, that one must dress decently, celebrate a name day, have an evening, etc. Oh, this devastating luxury! Why is there no barrier to it? If it were not for it, then many would have no need to exhaust themselves with work or directly resort to deception and unjust acquisitions. As for extravagance, an example of which, according to the Gospel, we see in the parable of the prodigal son, squandered his goods. Luke 15:13 here. At first glance, it seems as if there is still a character of non-covetousness, some kind of selfless kindness. But if we look closely, it turns out that simplicity is worse than theft. The extravagant person spends money or materials beyond his means. He only has money in his hands temporarily, and he is sure that after an accidental excess of it, he will again be overtaken by needs. It would seem that the most prudent thing for him to save a reserve of money for the subsequent time, to spend it gradually and only on the most necessary items. But no, he is as if angry with his money. He squanders it, drinks and eats sweet and expensive things, buys himself things that are not at all necessary. What comes of his generosity? He restricts himself in the contentment of life. Because, having suddenly squandered all his money, he begins to starve. Would it not be better for him to spread out over many months what he spends in 1 month? But he also inconveniences others, because he often asks from the same people to whom he boasted of his generosity and simplicity, whom he condemned for excessive stinginess, taking their frugality for stinginess. Would it not be better for him to deny himself superfluous whims than to burden others? Was not his generosity at someone else's expense? Oh, mad extravagance, Christian! If you are not accustomed to luxury and extravagance, then you are happy. Those to whom luxury and extravagance have become a habit are no longer able to distinguish between luxury and contentment, and no matter how much money you give them, they will spend every amount. We see these examples especially in the children of the rich, but excessive luxury and extravagance rarely pass without impoverishment. Prov. 23:31. Both individuals and entire societies become poor from them. So, never reconcile yourself to these habits in the future. The challenge of spending money, on the one hand, and spending it, on the other, on theaters, circuses, and taverns. Here are the house eaters met. 23:14. Those people who perform in theaters, maintain circuses, arrange entertainment venues, and also open taverns with music during lunches and dinners in places where, meanwhile, everyone has always had his own home. There was not yet a single superfluous expense in the city, and these idle lovers settle in it, or temporarily come to it. They rent temporary premises, send out advertisements, and people flock to them. And next to their entertaining dishes, they supply snacks and drinks, a buffet, and they begin to pour money into them, and not kopecks, but half rubles and rubles. They do not care whether this money comes to them from hard work or easily earned, from excess or from poverty. They only want to have more of their own proceeds. They will not thank the people, but perhaps laugh at their simplicity. And it is incomprehensible to the mind where the people get the money for theaters, circuses, taverns. The entertainers use all the baits to attract people to themselves. Music in their taverns during dinner, also an outstretched hand for money. Just look at them as artists, hear their voices, see their movements. All this is so valued that you have to pay them half a ruble in rubles. Oh, merciless people! They are mostly alien to the Russian foreigners. But even more unpardonable is the mercilessness to themselves of those of the people who frequent their establishments. As if the visitors had all their necessary and essential expenses covered when they brought money to theaters, circuses, booths, and hotels. Would it not be more honest for these people to pay their debts or public service than to take their money to insatiable places? Would it not be better for them to take care of building or buying a house for themselves, or to repair the roof on their house that is leaking, than to spend a fair amount of money on empty pleasures during the year? How do they replenish the irretrievable waste of their money? For example, by not even thinking about expenses for the benefit of pure pleasures for the soul, such as buying a spiritual book to read, maintaining a church choir, or directly for the benefit of the salvation of the soul, such as alms to the poor. But they will say the government itself permits theaters, circuses, etc. It permits, but does not send there, but does not advise to carry the last money for entertainment. The government is not the church. It does not teach strict rules of life and what constitutes the one thing needful. Luke 10:42, because the right of this teaching belongs only to the Church of Christ. It does not concern the conscience and private life of each of the citizens, but only pursues direct evil for the people in the economic or moral sense, and sometimes it prefers the lesser evil to the greater. No, the government has no reason to cover up its guilt, either for the maintainers of public entertainments or for those who go to these entertainments. It will be even more pleasant for the government if more local wealth and contentment are preserved among the people. After all, whole thousands leave another city in one summer, and not a particularly large one, after these guests with entertainment performances with animals, with wonderful tricks. In the old days, people did not know such entertainments, but they did not grieve over futile expenses, and were more thrifty than we are, both in the household and for spiritual saving expenses. Orthodox Christian. Do not look at the representatives of various amusements and spectacles as encroachers on your fortune. We urge you protect your remains from them, and especially do not spare them from taking away the last. Unreasonable refusal to lend to a neighbor or to guarantee him, or, on the contrary, lending him beyond his means, give to him that asketh thee mat. 542. A good man will be surety for his neighbor, Sir 29:17. Borrowing and surety constitute mutual assistance to Korba 8:14, preserving the property of both one's neighbor and one's own from vain expenditure. What loss is there in lending anything to a faithful man? Even if he becomes the full owner of what was borrowed and spends it, he returns the same amount, the same measure or weight, and in relation to money, which is a common means of exchange, he gives it back in the same figure. What loss is there in being surety for such a man? Surety requires one certification, or hope for another. So, this is a real insult to an honest man who has always paid his debts and wants to pay, but who, in need, is refused, even by those to whom he himself once lent. He goes to another with the sure hope of borrowing, but hears in reply, "I am sorry, but I have no money to give." This is love for one's neighbor only in word and in tongue, and not in deed. 1 John 3:18. The one in need of money may not sleep at night, not knowing where to borrow it for the required time. But the one who could lend him does not think about his sleepless nights and worries. This person has either not experienced extreme needs, or, having lived in comfort for a long time, has forgotten his former needs. He offers the one asking for a loan only such a service that he should apply for a loan to such and such a person. But rather than advise uselessly, because the other will probably refuse in the same way, it would be better to help. He refuses because he allegedly has no money. But rather than lie so obviously, it would be better to answer directly that he does not intend to lend. He begins to tell of his own needs, but these stories make it even harder for the petitioner, because they only make him feel the love of his neighbor more strongly, no more than by word and tongue. So it is better for a person in need after many vain requests for a loan or surety not to ask at all. Better not to waste time, but to rely solely on God's help and wait for a change in his circumstances. Otherwise, he may feel disgust for all his acquaintances. But creditors reason. Many do not keep their word about a loan. They speak with a humble voice and are ready to kiss hands until they are given money as a loan. And when they receive the money, they consider it their own find. Sir. 29:4. This applies to people unknown or of doubtful fidelity. There is another commandment of the Word of God for us in the case of a loan from a neighbor. Help your neighbor according to your ability, sir. 29:23, and especially surety has led to the ruin of many, sir. 29:20, that has led to the loss of one's own property. For example, a family man who is just providing for his family and home obviously has no time to lend money or to vouch for someone. Besides, another person has no occupation or leisure to go and present for collection debts from debtors who would not pay. In the latter case, it is better to directly help an unknown person who asks for a loan, but at the same time is ready to accept assistance, than to let him go from you empty-handed. And in any case, each of us has the opportunity to lend consumable things. For example, bread, a candle. No, you, good Christian, lay down for yourself the following rules. If you have a fortune, lend money to a person known to you by honesty, such as already your share to lend. If you do not have cash reserves, then never refuse a neighbor a loan, even in small things or materials that you have. Let you not bother others by borrowing money, and especially do not go or send to your neighbors for anything, having all sorts of things in stock, but lend to your neighbor for the sake of the commandment of God and for his peace. On unjust acquisitions, illegal interest do not take from him, the poor, usury or interest, and fear your God. Lev 25:36. In relation to the same poor, we are given the commandment in the gospel, lend, expecting nothing in return. Luke 6:35. This means that interest, usury, should not be demanded from a poor person who borrows either money or materials, does not borrow with the aim of his own profit or enrichment, but only to meet his needs. For example, if he builds or buys a house for himself, which he did not have and which he desperately needs because he has a large family, a rich person is obliged to lend him money, expecting nothing. If in rural life such a poor person asks for a loan of rye for spring sowing, a wealthy peasant must lend him simply, and not demand double the amount of rye or compensation in personal work for the loan in addition to the payment. Conscience forbids the charging of interest to such poor people and in such needs, and the Church rules strictly condemn it. 1 Ecumenical Council 17 and elsewhere. One must make up for one's neighbor's shortcomings, while they are increased by interest. Thus, for the poor, a Christian does not lend out his money at interest, Psalm 14:5. But, at the same time, interest on money, as well as on the measure and weight of borrowed materials, is not contrary to Christian law, if the debtor receives a special fruit or profit from the loan. Why is it not contrary? Because he benefits from such a loan, and it is for the sake of benefits that he borrows. The lender, of course, also has the right to participate in these benefits. Then the capital or material lent is exposed to danger. Should not this fear be rewarded? However, interest does not always and substantially belong to the loan. It depends on the will of the creditor either to lend with interest or simply even for a whole year, and even if the person lent is not poor, and not in return for a mutual loan from him at some time, but only out of respect for his noble need. Without a doubt, the interest should be moderate, and only then they are not contrary to Christian law. How to determine their measure? They are moderate, therefore, not unlawful, since both parties, the creditor and the usurer, benefit from them. But if the benefits from them are only on the side of the creditor, the obvious loss to the debtor, then they constitute usury a sin before God and a violation of the civil law. But since here too their figure is not yet determined, and since it cannot be determined exclusively by the arbitrariness of the creditors, then this question could be decided and is decided by the government alone. According to the law, interest rates over 6% are considered interest, and in the event of the debtor losing the loan, not only are they not protected by law, but are also subject to Court 218. In addition to this amount, the law allows interest to be accepted only for charitable purposes, for example, for guardianship when borrowing guardianship money. Also, some may offer, and others may take over 6%, if there is no effort on one side and the benefit of the other is obvious. After this, it is understandable how, contrary to all laws, those Christians act who, following the example of Jewish usurers, assign double and triple interest to usurers above the prescribed interest. and not for a year, but for 6 months or even less. Is this not a flagrant misappropriation? Can such interest be profitable for the usurer? In essence, they will only increase his loan, and consequently his needs. If not immediately, then later on, they will certainly seem to him a heavy burden. If he did not need the money, he would not ask with effort. But the bankers justify themselves. The one who borrows money himself agrees to pay the interest that is offered to him. No, it is not he who agrees, but his need, or, to be more precise, he agrees to any interest, swallowing a tear, because otherwise he would not have received the loan. Yes, to demand and take high interest, this means the same as collecting money for yourself from the tears and sighs of your neighbor. Here is both misappropriation and inhumanity. You, Christian, in some cases follow the Christian law this time, and in others do not deviate from civil laws. Extortion, bribes. We have wronged no one, we have sought no one's gain, 2 Cor 7. To bribery is a gift offering of money, things, intentional loss, for example, at cards, the sale of something for a pittance. The mere work of a craftsman or a worker for the house an illegal gift, on the one hand, and its acceptance on the other. The goal here is only that the one who accepted the gift did something in favor of the giver that is contrary to the duties of his service or the duty of truth. Bribery is considered complete if the money or things are only promised, and consent is expressed to deviate from the law and from the very force of the law because of them. But there is still no bribery in payments for the preparation of such documents that are not received in the place where the author himself serves, or which are prepared with the permission of the authorities. Also, gifts for good deeds, only for service and vows, perhaps for service without pay at all, do not constitute bribes, in any case not for the sake of concessions to law and justice. The guilt of bribery is more serious when certain exactions are appointed. Extortion is allowed, or the one who could bring a gift languishes in anticipation of something. Thus, for example, Felix languished the Apostle Paul in prison, whether Paul would bring him a bribe, Acts 24:26. In this sin, in addition to the two parties, the giver and the receiver, sometimes other persons participate. Thus, one undertakes to hand over a bribe, it happens, and conceals it. Another, for example, a superior, reliably knows about the bribery of his confidant, and condones the bribery either for his own gain, as most often happens, or only out of weakness of character. What is the fault of the bribe taker in fact from the monetary or property side? He unjustly collects money for himself in order to live or to make up capital. He receives a salary according to his position, and does not want to be content meanwhile, as it is said, "Be content with your salary," Luke 3:14. They say this time, someone has very little salary and great needs. In that case, this person could find another position with a higher salary, or find some additional work to his position with payment. Abuse, as well as stealing, is not allowed even in a poor state. I bear some secondary position without a salary at all. If the position takes up time for maintenance, he has the right to refuse it. And if the position was accepted out of honor and zeal, then it should be carried out only out of honor. A bribe taker offends his neighbor, receiving from him what does not belong and often squeezing 50 kopecks or a ruble from the poor. Most often, he is wealthier than the bribe taker. It means that here the poor man gives to the rich man. And this rich bribe taker, without any shame, keeps other people's money even in a case when he has not yet managed to do anything according to his promise. The poor swindler is forced 100 times for the money that he brought to him, and which he imagines to be simply lying there in a heap with other acquisitions, or which has already passed from him as an inheritance to relatives. But he can no longer take back his money. Nowadays, some do not take petty bribes, and in this case they present themselves as disinterested. But are not large bribes and occasional ones the same bribery, and are they not abuse if they are received even from the richest man? Are not annual salaries from entire institutions, companies and offices the same bribes of an insignificant official? They say in justification of themselves, "The gift was brought to me without my prior consent, and was not desired by me." If so, then it should be returned. Otherwise, everyone will bring gifts without asking or agreeing, and sometimes they even seem to forget the thing, or, as if because of their inability to play cards, lose money to you. They even beg me to accept the gift. They would not beg if they did not expect a deviation from the law, or a cover for omissions and abuses for the sake of the gift. No one will throw money without need, that is true. Sincerity and humility of the request is here only until the money or things are handed over. And then they look at the bribe-taker, even if he is a high official, as a man bought, and they treat him more boldly, without any respect in their souls. But with a gift, neither a deviation from the law nor any injustice is allowed, but only leniency is shown, only the course of the matter is accelerated. Some rituals are bypassed without damage to the matter in the sense of legality. All this should be done even without a forced hint, delay, languor, gift. Actually, out of humanity, out of respect for the person of the petitioner or his circumstances. In a word, there will be no end to pretexts and excuses if someone wants to take monetary and material gifts in service or in such matters that he was obliged to perform gratuitously. Bribery finally turns into a habit, a passion of its own kind. And doubling the salary does not correct some from vice, as, on the contrary, an honest man, even with a small salary, but at the same time with a large family, he does not dare to take bribes. The apartment of this employee is cramped, and his board, clothes, reception of visitors are poor, but his conscience is calm, but he is more firm in his place. And he who is accustomed to bribes as to easy and quick enrichment, it is as if he does not care about himself in the future. Even if he remains out of service for a long time for his guilt, but, having received a position, he again rushes to take bribes, thinking to compensate for his losses. But in 6 months or in a year, he loses his place again. No, the most firm determination to refuse bribes is needed, and this determination can be awakened and supported in the soul by only one thing: Christian conscience. Where are those pure, selfless individuals who could not be bribed with any offerings, who would not tolerate bribes in other persons, all for the sake of one Christian truth and honesty, and without allowing other evil in their service, namely, doing nothing? Where are these individuals? We would glorify them because they are a wonder, sir. 31, 9 each in his own place. But give them, Lord, more for every time. What can we say about the guilt of those who give bribes? The guilt of bribe givers is also undoubted, although lesser. They give interest against their own convictions. Therefore, they recognize it as an illegal act. They also sometimes get rich through bribes, for example, under some contract, or just continue their evil acquisitions of money and property unhindered, for example, in some position. They buy themselves with money a reward, a place of service, or innocence in their offense. They incline either the boss himself, or his secretary, or those close to him to an act contrary to the duties of the service, to obvious injustice. The evil increases if they bring a bribe, for example, to a high-ranking person under the guise of a pleasing to God or charitable donation, neither before nor after also not donating. Nor can one remain silent about the insult they do to honest people, to whom, judging by themselves or by the example of others, they thrust a wad of money into their hands and beg them to accept it for no apparent reason. A truly honest person, let us suppose, will regret such an action and will not hold them accountable. But still, it is hard on his moral sense when he says that he cannot accept a gift, and yet is begged to accept it. Finally, those who give a bribe needlessly deprive themselves of money or things. They deprive themselves at the same time of the right to complain about the bribe taker if the gift turns out to be a waste. They pay this person only with public condemnation, reproaches, and contempt, and when, while he will no longer have any influence on them, having lost his position, he leaves them. Yes, to offer and give bribes is just as shameful and guilty before God. You, Christian, do not bind yourself to either one or the other, neither by offering nor by accepting bribes, if you are placed in a tempting, this time, state. So everything will be untied for you, everything will be in good freedom, both conscience and tongue and hands, and your own request and refusal of another's request. Excessive bargaining when buying something or pressing the seller in price when he apparently needs to sell his goods or things. So, in their turn, buyers offend sellers. How? By lowering the prices of their things. They offer a price that is either lower than the goods or barely equal to its value. Therefore, they want, as it were, to take the goods or thing for nothing. Some do this because they do not know the real prices for the things they buy. Others because they do not trust the seller, judging him by the example of others. That is, as if he asks and wants to take more than necessary. The seller no longer knows how to convince them of the truth of his words. Thus, they drive him to swearing, if he has the habit of swearing. He, finally, especially if this is not the owner himself, but only a trusted person in the store, comes to the most tense state of mind from the excessive number of buyers, because they offer him an incongruous price for the goods. They point to other shops where the same things are supposedly sold cheaper. They belittle the goodness of his goods. But he cannot give a sharp answer that would make the buyers either decide to buy sooner or, what is most likely, leave the shop, because he is a person, in his own way, dependent on the buyers, because otherwise he might earn the reputation of a rude clerk. And so it happened that some even fell ill, having to endure such a tense state of mind from many buyers in a row. But excessive bargaining is especially guilty in the case when it happens consciously and intentionally. For example, some merchant is in a critical situation with his trade. He needs to quickly sell his goods and get money. Or, for example, some official moving somewhere for service must somehow sell his real estate and perhaps also his house. Or, for example, the relatives of a deceased person need to convert things into money, which they do not need for themselves. Buyers come to these people before others, who offer them half the price or even less for the things. Buyers sometimes do not need the things they buy at all, but only take advantage of the opportunity of buying them for nothing, in order to sell them later to others at a higher price, or to possess themselves without pity what they have acquired for a pittance, as if they were glad of the critical situation of their neighbor, as if they themselves could not be in the same situation. After all, if not a temporary transfer due to position or other circumstances, then the final and general transfer into eternity will overtake them too. So they might think that after them, there will also be things offered for sale that they owned. Why indeed should we force the seller with excessive bargaining? If you do not have the means to pay for the thing you are buying, then we must deny ourselves the passionate desire to acquire it, or buy the same thing of inferior quality and therefore at a lower price. The merchant is not to blame if we do not have enough money to give him the real price. And yet, let us put ourselves in his position. How sensitive our mistrust is to him. How sad it is for us to force him to take advantage of his property without his right. And how precious his time is sometimes to talk to us in vain. Likewise, why should we oppress those who sell things when they are leaving or after someone's death? Is this not direct misappropriation? Let them agree to the most extreme concessions, but their consent is forced. In their souls, they grumble at us. We should, in a Christian way, help them so that they quickly untie themselves from the things that bind them, and not oppress them. It is not in vain that some well-intentioned people, having other buyers in mind, consider it a rule not to buy anything after the misfortunes of a neighbor. You, Christian, avoid unnecessary squabbles with sellers, in which self-interest, insult to the merchant, and anxiety of your own spirit are hidden. Stinginess, fasting at one's own table. The city will murmur at him who is stingy with bread, sir. 31:28 even for bread, and at his table he suffers want. Sir. 14:10. When, on the one hand, many essential needs in the family and at home, and on the other hand, the limitation of means, force us to give up the desire to make a dinner or supper at home, that we may rejoice with my friends Luke 15:29, then this is both reasonable and will hardly cause any murmuring among us. In such a case we deny ourselves many of the necessities of life. But if someone denies himself and others when he has good means, if, for example, he never invites anyone to his home for bread and salt, meanwhile he himself attends other people's dinners and suppers. If at home he eats only dry and salty things, if he dresses in greasy, holy, and poor clothes, walks on the road when he could drive, or travels in a slow and cheap cart instead of a fast and quiet one, such a person denies himself the essentials not for the sake of some kind of asceticism or in order to have more leftovers for the benefit of the poor, but only out of pity for money or materials, only for a still greater increase of his means. Such a refusal is called stinginess. This is the most insane miserliness, the extreme degree of avarice. What is stinginess like? It cannot be compared with anything. Comparing it in a moral sense with extravagance, we will still find extravagance less worse. The extravagant person considers the goal of life, at least in part of his person. The miser considers it outside himself in money and property. In relation to the Lord God, this person is an ungrateful creature. He does not know how to thank God, who gives us richly all things for enjoyment. 1 Tim 6:17. Because he does not enjoy his goods, because his goods lie buried in the earth. He annoys his neighbor by always being dry to everyone who visits him. And can he be kind to others who are evil to himself? It seems that a miser would sooner give away part of his body than give his neighbor some of his money or bread. But, we repeat, he is especially evil or an enemy to himself. He hungers and freezes and is tired from walking, and does not get enough sleep without knowing why, as if he were appointed to take care of someone else's, and not to have his own. He envies himself, Sirach 14:6, and at the same time steals from himself. He collects and keeps only for others. What he thought about, what he did not dare to touch, after him will go from hand to hand and will be quickly spent. Christian, marvel at how people are either luxurious and wasteful, or on the contrary stingy to the point of miserliness. How rare is a person who would not be tempted by money and in one way or another would not abuse it. Sir. 31:9. What is impossible with men is possible with God. Luke 18:27. Demanding payment for every little service, and whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him. 2. Matthew 5:41. The general meaning of this gospel commandment is that if someone demands a small favor from us, we should try to render a double favor. Oh, how this commandment is especially forgotten nowadays. Someone walked one street to show a stranger an unknown house, or carried someone's things on the road for a distance of several steps, or was asked to go somewhere for 5 or 10 minutes, or helped to take off his outerwear in someone's hallway, and what then? For all this, everyone demands payment for tea, for a loaf of bread, for wine. This happens with common people, but is it better in the class of the educated and noble? A lawyer or an expert in the law gave someone advice on a matter in his home. A skilled accountant checked someone's bill and certainly demands payment. Every service nowadays expects payment. Every talent is valued in money. What kind of fleecing of one's neighbor at every step is this, and sometimes of one's neighbors for whom it would still be pleasant to serve, for example, a clergyman? Where is the noble, selfless labor for the benefit of one's neighbor? How the word neighbor is forgotten here. How people show themselves to be strangers to each other. It is not a pity to pay for the slightest service, even more so than those who cannot pay at every step. But a heavy feeling awakens in the soul when you see that they do not want to render you even the slightest service simply out of brotherly disposition, when, moreover, they do not imagine your own freedom and care to reward for the service, but remind and besiege you with requests. You, Christian, even if you are not rich, love selfless helpfulness to your neighbor, even in small things. If they say to you for a service, "Thank you," then accept it with consolation, because, having broken down this word into its component parts, we receive such goodwill from our neighbor. God save you. Repeat after your neighbor the same speech in your soul, replacing in it the word you with the word me, and then you will feel some relief after serving your neighbor. Extorting other people's money through work and selling useless things that are not for capital and essential use but for vanity alone, are called idle things. Often there is no convenience in using them. The only pleasure they bring is for the eyes and for the mind novelty, since people love to pounce on something bright and new. Wherever it would be possible to do without a thing at all, or to be satisfied with the most simple, homemade thing, they come up with a cunning thing, sometimes funny, and special traders and shops appear to sell such things. Meanwhile, all these things from a matchbox to silver tobacco containers are quite valuable. Is it not obvious that their craftsmen and sellers only lure other people's money with them? Is this not, to some extent, an abuse on the part of craftsmen and merchants? Could not the hands of the former and the shops of the latter be occupied with objects more reasonable and useful for use? Reader, if you are a craftsman or a trader in small things, do not involve your neighbor in unnecessary expenses by offering him something from yourself, and not cheap in price, idle, and not quite necessary. Perhaps he needs bread, and not your fashionable or funny things. Reader, if you are a craftsman or a trader in small things, do not involve your neighbor in unnecessary expenses by offering him something from yourself, and not cheap in price, idle, and not quite necessary. Perhaps he needs bread, and not your fashionable or funny things.